It was very similar to an interrogation. Someone asked questions, and a little girl sitting in the same room had to answer them without thinking for long. The girl was called Child of Destiny, and the questioner asked her to tell him about herself. First, she greeted the questioner. The girl's name was LeBlanc. She was 4 years old, and she considered herself a false child of fate. She said simply, "Hello, my name is LeBlanc." She said she was very comfortable with regression. It was strange that a 4-year-old could know what that word meant. She added that it happened when she was hugged. Regression was her specialty. She was reborn during death. After this, the interviewer reminded the young interviewee that she had said she was a false child of fate and asked if she could tell him from the very beginning what had happened to her. He would be interested in hearing all of it, down to the last detail. And although the girl pondered the questions for a long time, it was clear she wanted to be completely honest, saying she hadn't meant to deceive anyone and that the people from the temple had simply misinterpreted the prophecy. She said the men from the temple had misinterpreted the oracle, blaming her for everything. In the mind of a small child, everything that was happening now was unfair. Just like the events of her life, she too had suffered and considered herself a victim. It seemed the questioner didn't know what he was asking, although the question rather oddly reminded him that after her third regression, the girl had gone to a duchy called LeBlanc, known as the birthplace of the villain of the entire realm. Oddly enough, he asked specifically about LeBlanc, who was a false child of fate. That's right. She had found herself in the duchy. She intended to do everything to please the Duke and empty his purse. Since they were forgotten by the gods themselves, she planned to win the Duke's favor and make a fortune there. It was quite unexpected, and it seemed that the questioner was also very surprised by the answer of a small 4-year-old child, in whose body such a cunning person was found. The girl no longer intended to live in an immoral country. And if the regression continued, she would be forced to die over and over again. So she said she had no intention of living in a world of shame. If she stayed here, she would die again and again, and she didn't want that at all. She's determined to extract money from the villainous Duke and thereby prepare for her escape from the country. That's why she's decided to do everything possible and impossible to achieve this. But it's not all that simple, because the ducal mafia is anything but simple. It's safe to say the girl has fallen into a real criminal organization, and escaping isn't easy. The family was simply a criminal syndicate, led by a real criminal and villain. The little child suddenly remembered her fourth life for a moment. An Arctic survival guide would have been the best way to help her remember this. She remembered every life she'd ever lived, and it was far from perfect. Surviving in the house of the criminal Duke was not much like surviving in the jungle. Even there, she found it much easier than in the evil house. So, she is ready to begin the main theme of her story, namely, the survival of a 4-year-old child, whom everyone considered a child of destiny, in the estate of the villainous Duke. As it happened to her, she didn't remember how the regression began. At that moment, the girl was sleeping in a small, luxurious crib in a richly furnished room. After that, she closed her eyes and sighed heavily, began to look in front of her, trying to understand where she was and how she got here. She looked at her small palms and wondered what had happened again. Another regression had occurred, and after her death, she was again. After this, the little child's gaze moved a little lower, and she began to examine her small, trembling legs, now lowered from the bed. Then she noticed a mirror in front of her and leaned over, staring intently into the face that was looking back at her with exactly the same attentive eyes. She realized she'd regressed again. Even though she'd known this could happen, she was still ready to scream at what she saw, horrified by her transformation. She was healthy again. She should have gotten used to it by now, but all the trials of the last few years had simply worn her down, and she didn't want to end up in some forgotten and cruel place. She recalled what had originally preceded this. The oracle and everything connected with it had unfolded in a strange, incredible sequence, difficult for a small child to comprehend. She was still a child of fate. The village where the girl lived was full of oddities. For example, anyone born on February 29th received divine powers. That child was destined to save their world. This is what the oracle had predicted. The divine power of the child everyone called the child of destiny. Tired of the long search, they combed even the poorest sections of the population, trying to find children born on that very predicted date. Therefore, according to the oracle's prediction, The entire imperial family and its entourage, as well as the church, searched for the child chosen by God, who could subsequently save their state. It was for this purpose that priests and monks were sent to all the remote provinces of the country to search. It was a difficult job, and they sought help not only from the poor, but also from noble families. It was imperative to find that very child, the one everyone called the Child of Destiny. The search was carried out continuously throughout the country. Many people were involved, and the entire state lived in anticipation of the result. In remote provinces, there are so many small children. Priests were forced to scour entire territories in a futile search for the little child sent by God, who would surely save their sinful world. And finally, their search was crowned with success. The two young monks were lucky. They found the child and began to look at him. Grabbing the little girl by the hand, the young monk exclaimed, "Here she is!" He was completely sure of it, smiling joyfully and rejoicing at his unexpected find. Leblon looked at him, still not really understanding anything. True, her birthday was February 29th, but was she a child of destiny? It was she who was considered the possessor of divine power. It was the little girl who was chosen and immediately brought to the capital. After the girl was brought to the well-kept capital of the empire, the imperial family faced another choice. They had to choose a family that would adopt the child of destiny. After that, a completely new life began for the girl. Even before the family's choice had been made, the church took charge of her education. But, unfortunately for the girl and everyone around her, no change in her divine power was observed. For this reason, she decided she wasn't truly a child of fate, and this greatly distressed her. All the clergy were perplexed. They couldn't understand why a child born on February 29th still hadn't shown any signs of strength. Unfortunately, the girl never managed to activate her divine power before her death. Even during her lifetime, gossip began surrounding her. This situation caused the girl deep suffering. She was so tormented that she even wanted to die. Everything changed a little at the moment when the imperial family and the church were preparing to abandon her, and she was already on the verge of despair. It was at that moment that everything changed dramatically. The girl's life took a sharp turn because something completely unexpected was discovered. At that moment, a true child of fate, as foretold by the oracle, appeared for all to see in the empire. Unfortunately, it wasn't her. It was at that moment that she became a fraud. The entire empire began to regard her as a swindler and criminal who had allegedly deliberately taken advantage of the situation. It was because of the crime of being imprisoned in the imperial prison and the crime of deceiving the imperial family and the temple that she was later condemned by the people and the court and eventually died as a sacrifice to seal away the evil. But, fortunately or unfortunately, everything repeated itself due to an evil regression. She was condemned to be born again and again, and each time, for some reason, she was taken for an oracle's prophecy, a child of fate. Apparently, such was her destiny. At the moment the girl died, her entire life flashed before her eyes. She had been deeply unhappy in it, even in those moments when she was considered God's chosen child. She recalled how, as a small child, she had been tutored by clergy. They strove to provide her with the most comprehensive education possible, preparing her for future great achievements. She also recalled her walks around the city. After all, she was just a small child, and nothing childish was foreign to her. She often peered into the shop windows that had so captivated her, and now she opened her eyes again after her death in the next life. It turned out she had returned to the body of a child. This frightened her. She didn't want to live the same life over and over again, only to have it end so fruitlessly. Of course, at first she was overjoyed at having escaped death. She jumped up from her seat and began jumping, thanking God for everything. She decided that she would not waste her life and would live it as worthily as possible. However, to her regret, failure awaited her. Once again, she met death because she failed to live up to expectations. She was not that child of destiny, but merely a mistake. She had no desire to repeat her fate. She understood that nothing in life would change compared to her previous incarnations, since she was once again in a child's body, and the same trials and disappointments awaited her. But now she had all her previous experience to prepare her for what lay ahead. After all, she now knew what it meant to be a child of destiny. The girl awaited the arrival of the Dowager Empress. She had to prepare thoroughly, knowing what lay ahead. The ladies of the court appeared with a difficult choice to make. And finally, the day has come when the Dowager Empress forces her to choose a father. This marks the beginning of the upcoming regression, which will completely change her life. The first candidate for paternity was a righteous knight of the empire, standing in its defense. That man was Duke Amiti, widely known within the realm and beyond. The second contender was a family whose descendants are among the empire's scholars. Their family was renowned for its scholarship and education, and its most renowned representative was Duke Valan. They became famous throughout the state and beyond its borders thanks to their teachings, brought great benefit, and earned universal glory and respect. And there remained one more contender. He was different from the previous two, a villain who possessed the most powerful army and wealth in the entire country. His name was Duke Dublan. Until now, the girl knew what had happened to her in her first life. She chose Duke Amiti, who looked very friendly and seemed very pleasant. As it turned out, her choice in her first life had been quite good. The Duke turned out to be, as rumors had it, a kind and calm man, and she was very happy. She liked the Duke's house so much that she even wrote a note for him, which read, "Father, I love and thank you." She decided to give the note to her adopted father, and just happened to meet him in the corridor as he was walking along it and talking about something with his assistant. But everything turned out completely differently than the girl had imagined. That time, her father simply walked past her, paying no attention to her, as if she didn't exist. There seemed to be an insurmountable wall between them. She knew she was a complete stranger and alone in this house, but she still decided that perhaps her father was very busy, and that was why she didn't resent him at all. An orphan, she was happy to finally have a father. Everything was going well until another person arrived in the house. This girl burst into their lives like a real hurricane, and everything immediately changed. Her name was Mila. From her very first appearance, she began to flatter the Duke. She told him she was simply enchanted by him and was his admirer. As a result, she charmed him, and his father adopted Mila because of her resemblance to his late first love. The young Duke and his adopted daughter hit it off immediately. They spent a lot of time together. He always told her it wasn't worth it, to which she replied, "So what? I just want to show off that I'm your daughter, and I enjoy your company." As a result, the girl was left completely alone in this house. She felt abandoned and lonely. No one paid any attention to her, as if she didn't exist at all. As a result, after all this, she found herself in a cold dungeon behind iron bars. She was thrown there and recognized by the entire world as a fraud who had pretended to be a child of fate. And from behind the bars, she shouted out a phrase in her defense. "No, I didn't poison Mila." When the Duke appeared before her, he stood in the basement and loudly exclaimed, "Does she really think he'll believe this?" and loudly called her a monster. After this, she was falsely accused of trying to poison Mila. As a result, her father hated her. He couldn't forgive her for allegedly poisoning his second adopted daughter. LeBlanc tried for a long time to explain to him that she was not guilty of anything and never wished Mila any harm, but all her excuses and requests remained unanswered. The young Duke looked at her sternly, his eyes gleaming with a terrifying coldness. He wanted only one thing, for this girl to be dead as punishment for the crime she had committed. She couldn't believe her ears. The Duke had said that if she repented, she must become a victim of evil. She once again, pleadingly, said, "Father," and didn't argue with him. It seemed it was all useless. She simply had no choice but to submit to her father. No one in the world could protect her now, and as a result, death came for her, and the girl fell into oblivion. She remembered vividly how her entire body suddenly shuddered, and she felt as if she were falling into some empty space. All she could do at that moment was scream loudly in horror. Thus she met her death. But then something unimaginable happened. She woke up again, screaming, in her crib as a 4-year-old child. Thus, her first regression occurred. When she was again offered the choice of a foster family, she thought, "I'm not going to Amity House again. Am I a complete fool?" She hadn't forgotten what had happened to her there in her previous life. In her second life, her choice was completely different. She chose the family of Duke Volan. He and his wife were immediately very kind to her. They said, "Welcome to our home, LeBlanc. Their family looked like a beautiful picture, but something terrible hid behind it. Inside, these aristocrats were simply terrible people, constantly beating her and mocking the girl, asking why she hadn't yet manifested her divine power. The one who bullied her the most was Duke Volan's wife. She declared that rumors that this girl was a fraud had already spread widely, and they couldn't tolerate it any longer. Something had to be done about it. Duke Volan called her a useless piece of trash, and in a fit of rage, couldn't contain himself. He beat his little pet as punishment for failing to live up to their expectations. It was this man who raised his hand against her, who caused her latest death. He personally killed the little girl he was supposed to be caring for. Thus, her next death came, but she was already prepared for it, and therefore did not experience great horror. She met this death with cold resignation. But this time, even death was surprised when it saw who it had come for. It never expected to see her again. The girl died again. The time had come for the next regression. After that, there was a third life. It, too, was far from a bed of roses. And in this third life, LeBlanc tried to escape rather than wait for someone to kill her. But, unfortunately, her strength and that of the world around her were far from equal. What could a small child do without a single coin to live on? Sadly, the same fate awaited her. Eventually, death came to her a third time. She couldn't survive the harsh winter conditions and died of starvation. As death bent over her, the last of her strength deserted her. She shivered from the cold, and her stomach ached with hunger. Thus, death came for her 3 times, and each time it took her. Finally, the time had come for another, 4th choice. This was now in the present tense, and she faced another choice. She reflected on how Duke Amity was a terrible man, and Volan was even worse. She still couldn't escape. It seemed she had no other choice, only one path left. As much as she didn't like it, she had to choose from 4 options, 3 of which she had already tried. When she told those around her about her choice, it seemed that their eyes would pop out of their sockets. So surprised were the Empress and others at the choice of this little girl. She said she was choosing the most vicious villain in the Empire, and no one could change that. That's why she went to his luxurious mansion. Sometime later, after the girl had been delivered to her latest father's house, she was led inside this enormous building. Everything looked absolutely impressive, and she even covered her mouth with her hand in surprise. Before her eyes stood the man she had so recently chosen as her father and guardian. As soon as he saw her, he immediately asked the little girl, "Did they send me a child to boil and eat?" It was the greatest villain in this world, Duke Theodore Dublon. His assistant stood next to him. He announced that the girl had arrived with a letter from the Dowager Empress, stating that she entrusted the child to their care. The young man, his gaze hard and hostile, turned his head and asked again, "Has this old hag really gone completely mad to do such a thing?" Then he ordered the girl sent back immediately. After this, the young man turned around and headed somewhere into the depths of his huge palace, not paying attention to the comments of his assistant, who tried to object to him and gave some arguments. The little girl LeBlanc thought, "So this is what this sinister Theodore Dublon is like." She approached his assistant and carefully took him by the sleeve. She knew something about this man from past lives. He was considered a true villain and possessed of wealth. That's why she agreed to go to his house. He was known throughout the Empire. This man truly made an impression. If not for his terrible character, the previous Duke of Dublon had died several years ago. But LeBlanc couldn't understand why such a handsome and wealthy young man would remain single and unmarried. The aide approached the Duke and tried to persuade him otherwise. He stated that this was an excellent opportunity to improve relations with the Church, and that refusing Her Majesty's request would only complicate the situation. The little girl thought that all this was completely untrue. She mentally addressed him, "It's not like that at all, Uncle Aide." Watching the Duke leave, LeBlanc recalled her past experience. She knew perfectly well that her father couldn't truly threaten such a man. This clearly didn't bother her at all. But the girl had no other options. She had already looked around and realized she liked this place. A plan had already formed in her head. She decided that she should stay here as long as possible, grow up, get as much money as possible, and then just run away. With the money she could earn here, she could say to the Empire, "Bye-bye, damned Empire, I'm free." Her goal was exile. She imagined herself sitting somewhere by the sea and reminiscing. LeBlanc would sip a cocktail and tell her that her life in the country had been a nightmare, but life in exile was better. "Oh, I finally decided that I just need to stay here a little longer and then earn as much money as possible." That's why she had to insist on staying. But achieving this turned out to be much more difficult than she thought. The young Duke's assistant, standing nearby, was greatly surprised when a little girl, barely able to pronounce words, suddenly announced that they were expecting a tax audit on December 7th. It sounded completely unbelievable. The Duke himself was no less surprised. He stopped abruptly and turned his head back. The man couldn't understand how a child could know such things. The girl was ready to explode with indignation. It seemed that due to her poor pronunciation, the Duke understood almost nothing. Her development was a little slower. However, the Duke did catch part of what was said. He suddenly grabbed the little girl by the sleeve and pulled her toward him. Then he sat down in front of his little guest, looked closely into her eyes, and asked, "Do you mean to say that a tax inspector will come to me on December 7th? She put her finger to her lips and whispered, "It's a secret." "Yes, that's exactly what I said. But it's a big secret. You can't tell anyone about it." The girl also looked intently at the young man and silently prayed for only one thing: to give her a chance. She was sure she could be useful to him. LeBlanc wanted to stay in this house so badly that she was ready to do anything. She even wanted to cry. But so far, only a single tear slowly rolled down her small face. He was still hesitating and pondering what to do. Finally, the Duke asked his assistant, "How reliably are our accounting books kept?" The assistant looked at him in surprise. "You really believed the words of a 4-year-old? Meanwhile, LeBlanc stood nearby, anxiously listening to their conversation. She hoped her idea would be successful and the Duke would finally allow her to remain in the palace. She heard two men arguing. One said, "Are you really going to go to extremes and change the tax laws for this audit?" Another replied, "If you evade taxes, pay the fine and go your way." The only thing that mattered was that he believed her. He looked up and said, "Are you really saying a 4-year-old could know anything about a tax audit?" The assistant replied, "Even if there's even a grain of truth to this, we need to check it out. That's exactly what we need to do." Looking at the Duke's pensive face, the girl decided that perhaps everything had worked out. Perhaps he would finally believe that she could be of use to him. She raised her eyes and looked him straight in the face. With hope in her heart, LeBlanc thought, "There must be at least a little justice in this world. And then I can stay in this house." It seemed Duke Dublin had finally made up his mind. He looked at the girl, who had come a little closer to him, and declared that she smelled terribly. The young man's assistant standing nearby said it wasn't a problem at all. The Duke must know perfectly well that she could be given a bath, and the smell would disappear immediately. At that moment, the girl had no idea what would happen to her. She felt like a packaged item in a store, about to be returned as unsuitable. She wasn't sure if the information she'd shared had worked. There was little hope, but it remained. And now all that remained was to wait for a decision. Action was needed. With that in mind, LeBlanc leaped up from her seat and ran forward. She looked like a whirlwind breaking free, not expecting anything like this from the little girl. The assistant screamed loudly and tried to grab her by stretching out his hand. But it was too late. The next moment, it became clear that LeBlanc was about to fall. She had run too fast and was thrown forward with a thud. However, she didn't hit the floor. She landed on a much softer surface. The girl crashed right into Duke Dublin's leg and pressed her whole body tightly against it. She needed to stay in this house. She had to prove to both herself and the Duke that she could arrange her future life. He lifted the girl by the scruff of her neck, looked into her face, and asked, "Do you want to die?" It seemed he had no intention of leaving her here. However, the girl wasn't at all afraid of her young master. She stretched out her small palms to him and cried loudly, "Daddy, hugs!" The Duke, like a naughty kitten, lifted her higher by the scruff of her neck again, pulled her a little to the side, and said that the girl must be completely crazy if she was behaving like that. But LeBlanc wasn't at all fazed. She put her arm around the young Duke's shoulders and looked him straight in the eyes. There was only one thought in her head. She didn't want to die again. The girl only hugged the young man tighter around the neck, her whole appearance begging for only one thing. Please, let him let her stay. Then she decided to take her last chance and said loudly, "I like the Duke!" LeBlanc held on to his neck, and Duke Dublin, not understanding anything, supported her with his huge palm. The moment her head touched his shoulder, she whispered silently, "Don't eat me. Please don't eat me. I'll be a submissive and diligent daughter." Thus, the girl found herself in one of the wealthiest families in the empire. The empire was the most extensive territory in the world. It was a rather wealthy state, where luxury and grandeur reigned. These families occupied a special position in the country. All the nobility looked up to them, and state power and the imperial family itself relied on them. This state also had its own state religion, called Naryata. Everyone was forced to obey it, and it also served as the basis for state power. The number of priests was quite large. They spread their religious ideas everywhere, and almost everyone in the empire feared them to varying degrees. At the head of state stood the imperial family. The emperor, sitting proudly on the throne, relied on his wealth and power, as well as on his powerful vassals, who wielded enormous wealth and influence. But the imperial family wasn't limited to the emperor alone. During LeBlanc's time, the Dowager Empress, the current ruler's mother, also wielded enormous influence. Among the highest aristocratic families, 5 major families stood out in particular. Thanks to their long-standing influence, they wielded particular weight in the country. But LeBlanc knew that the entire order of the empire would soon change. This would happen when she turned 15. That's when the cycle would close, and true chaos would begin. From her past lives, she knew that of the 5 great families, after long struggles and bloody internecine wars, only one would remain. It was this family that would rule the empire from now on. The member of the family she was assigned to in her 4th life will be the victor. He will rise to the pinnacle of power and deal with his opponents. He wasn't a man with a bloodthirsty exterior. However, inside, he was a true villain. Duke Dublon. It was he who was destined to become the ruler of this world, the man to whom the rest of the empire would be forced to submit. And it was now that LeBlanc became part of this family. The young duke was still unaware of the fate that lay ahead. He continued to live his ordinary life, unaware of the trials the future held for him. As a result of her successful attempt to impress the duke, the girl was able to remain in this house. She became part of the villain's family. LeBlanc understood perfectly well that she would never become a member of this clan. But on the other hand, things weren't all that bad. Of course, this family was far from a blessing. But after 3 previous lives, she had practically no choice. Essentially, she was allowed to live in the Dublon mansion, but the task before her was far from simple. Her future was far more important than the present. A great deal of work lay ahead, and so she had to be prepared for anything. One of the men asked what else the old man had said. The girl cheerfully exclaimed in her incomprehensible language, "Ori Kalkan is on the old coat." In fact, it was completely unclear what she meant. That's why the young man looked at her with disbelief and obvious incomprehension. He couldn't figure out what her strange words meant. Other people similar to him gathered around the young man. These were the courtiers of Duke Dublon, who looked at the little girl with interest and slight laughter. Each of them tried to squeeze closer to get a better look at this unusual little girl. After all, she had just told them important information about the temple and the imperial family in exchange for a small reward. One of them exclaimed enthusiastically that it was simply astounding and that she was a true genius. But LeBlanc herself couldn't care less. The temple's collapse was pure happiness for her. She felt like a little devil, hastening the downfall of those who were her enemies. She wanted to tell these people as many secrets as possible about the priests. One of the men smiled broadly and declared that it seemed that this 4-year-old child really was a child of destiny, since otherwise it was impossible to explain where she got such knowledge from. When the others echoed his words, the girl paused for a moment. In past lives, she had also been called a child of destiny, but unfortunately, it had been quite different. She was not the child declared the chosen one. She paused, realizing that memories from past lives were her true weapon. However, this weapon had its limitations. Children have a hard time thinking as clearly as adults, and perhaps this was due to their immature brains. She noticed that if she was very tired, she began to act like a normal child. And if she ate well, she felt almost like a grown-up lady. But everything changed when she didn't have enough food. She was also thinking about how hunger and severe shock were also making her act like a child. At that moment, one of the young nobles leaned over and asked how she managed to be so smart. The girl was startled when he reached out and touched her ear. She screamed, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. LeBlanc didn't want to be touched. A moment later, she spotted Duke Dublon and immediately ran to him. The girl climbed into his arms and hugged him tightly around the neck. When the nobles saw this, they burst into laughter. One of them remarked that the little girl seemed very shy and simply not yet accustomed to so many people. Another agreed and said that there was nothing surprising in this, since she had talked about the temple and the imperial family while sitting on the duke's lap. The third added that it was no wonder she was hiding behind the duke, since she was still a little child, even if she seemed like a real genius. LeBlanc snuggled closer to her adopted father and realized she hadn't done it on purpose. It had all happened naturally, perhaps because of memories from past lives. But there was something strange, too. She suddenly realized she felt different around Dublon. She felt calm around him and almost no fear. When the Duke ordered her to dismount, she immediately obeyed and sat down next to him. The day was already drawing to a close. The warm rays of the setting sun fell over the Duke's palace. One of Duke Dublon's knights, a vassal, leaned over to the girl. He handed her a candy and thanked her for the information. Dublon joyfully exclaimed that it was candy and held out both hands for it. After this, the Duke's vassals began to disperse to their homes. On the way, they discussed the day's events and called LeBlanc a marvelous child. It seemed all these men liked her. Meanwhile, the girl sat next to the Duke and tried to remove the wrapper from the candy, but it turned out to be quite a difficult task for her. The next moment, someone's hand quickly snatched the candy from her palms. LeBlanc looked ahead, confused. One moment the candy was in her hands, and suddenly it had mysteriously disappeared. She stared in bewilderment at the empty space in front of her. After that, the girl turned her head slightly to the side and saw that her candy was still there. It was in someone's large, muscular hand, right before her eyes. At first, she was ready to burst into tears because the delicious thing was gone. Besides, she was a little hungry now and could have turned into a little crying child again. It seemed the worst time for her was approaching. But then, to her surprise, someone unwrapped the candy, and the sweet treat appeared right in front of her mouth. It was the Duke of Dublon, who took the candy, unwrapped it, and was now treating his little daughter to it. He looked at her and asked if he would feed her candy, and she would tell him what she knew about his family. She was an unusual child, and might know more than other children. LeBlanc looked at him in surprise. Of course, she could tell him something thanks to the knowledge she'd gained in previous lives, but she still had to be very careful, and out of caution, she decided it was best not to reveal herself just yet. So she began to jerk her head left and right, then loudly declared, "No." She decided she wouldn't tell Duke Dublon anything. The Duke didn't seem entirely pleased with her answer. The young man seemed upset and perhaps even angry, but all he could utter was a short question. "Why?" After this, the girl looked closely into the man's eyes, thought for a moment, and, mangling the words with her small, clumsy mouth, said, "Because I am not on the Duke's side." Her answer seemed to surprise the young man. Rather, he began to ponder the meaning of her words. It seemed this girl really could still be useful. After this, one of the servants approached and asked if they could take the child. The Duke turned sharply toward the man. His young charge, sitting on his lap, looked in the same direction, but she could not be sure of this, because the very next moment, with the words, "Don't make too much noise," the Duke picked her up by the scruff of her neck and, like some kind of puppy, handed her over to someone's hands. She wondered if it wasn't normal for a cold-blooded villain to behave like this. He owned literally everything. After all, Duke Dublon was the true king of this world. As it turned out, the girl had been handed over to one of the maids. She was immediately surrounded by other girls. They seemed ready to oblige her in every way. Another of the maids had pieces of cake on a tray, and this cake could also have ended up in her possession, because the maid immediately offered her a piece to eat. LeBlanc clutched her cheeks and thought that this was exactly what she'd missed so much in her previous lives. It seemed she'd be a welcome guest here, and everything would be at her disposal. Had she really found herself in a true paradise? A few days had flown by since she'd arrived at this house. She'd been changed, and she was free to play with her pony and work on puzzles. And although everything was wonderful, something was still bothering her. Her quiet life had seen quite a few behind-the-scenes events, and so she was very cautious. One day, one of the maids approached her and said, "Oh my God, you're so glad to see me." It really was like that. The girl immediately ran up to the other girl and started babbling in her incomprehensible language. All that could be made out was the girl's name, Linda, even though the girl herself was shouting, "Lintya, Lintya!" Then she said, "I'm glad, because Linda is the best." After that, the maid exclaimed, "My God, does the girl really love me more than anyone else?" This was very fortunate. She needed to win the heart of the head maid Linda. This could come in handy in carrying out her plan. After this, LeBlanc called another maid to her. When she leaned over, the girl said, "Okay, I'll give you some candy." This maid's name was Tani, but since she couldn't speak very well, it sounded completely different. After the maid asked the girl why she had given her such a delicious and precious candy, she put her finger to her face and said that Dani was simply a clever girl, and she wanted to thank her. The maid didn't know what to say. She just said loudly, "Oh my God!" and was delighted that the young mistress had noticed her. Thus, the girl had won the heart of another maid, the head appetizer maid. After that, it was time to win the heart of another maid. The girl noticed that she was very upset about something, leaning against the wall and crying bitterly about something. At that moment, the girl ran up to her, grabbed the hem of her dress, and began stroking her leg. She said she felt sad when Uni was sick. This servant's name was Uni, and this was a way to win her favor. After that, she acted just as cunningly. She smiled sweetly at Uni, looked her in the eye, and said that Uni was simply brilliant and that LeBlanc really liked her. This girl's heart was immediately won, and she was beside herself with joy. But she remembered God and declared that she was always ready to obey the young mistress's commands. This beauty's heart was also won, for the winning of hearts in this way was thus accomplished in this palace. After all this had happened, the maids, whenever they saw their young mistress, smiled broadly and rejoiced loudly. Upon meeting her, they exclaimed, "Oh my God, our darling!" LeBlanc was pleased to have won over all the head maids in the Duke's household. The task of winning the hearts of these young ladies was now complete, and the rest of the plan could begin. The girl pondered what she should do next. She decided that even if the head of the family hated her, as had once happened in the family of Duke Valan, it was no big deal. At least the maids in this house were now definitely on her side. But that wasn't even the best part. There was a girl in this house she liked more than anyone else, and her heart didn't need to be won. She always treated the girl well. As soon as she approached, her heart always rejoiced. But at the same time, the girl's status in the ducal household was rather precarious. She was often discussed by other residents of the house. The question constantly arose among them as to why they would bring a child who was simply a fake into the house. She felt rather strange, remembering that similar rumors had also surfaced in her previous lives. On the one hand, it was all true. It was just mean. But how could she change her fate? She simply decided that someday she would try to change everything. It was the girl she liked most who became LeBlanc's true protector in the ducal palace. Hearing rumors and gossip behind the girl's back, she loudly exclaimed in response, "How could they think like that? Aren't they ashamed to gossip in front of a child?" It was from that moment that LeBlanc, with tears in her eyes, suddenly realized that this maid was her true friend, someone she could trust and who loved her simply because she loved her. She didn't need to win her heart. She already had a kind, pure heart. It was this smiling girl named Linda who treated her special, even though she did nothing. Every time she put her to bed, she smiled sincerely and wished the child sweet dreams. Already curled up in her crib, the girl wondered if this was what children experience in the presence of their mothers. She felt so comfortable with Linda, so warm and cozy, so ready to spend all her time with her, and she was grateful for it. After Linda put her to bed, the dark night fell outside. Everything in the palace became quiet, and only the whistling of the wind outside the window broke the deathly silence inside the house. LeBlanc suddenly woke up and opened her eyes wide. It was pitch black, but it wasn't that was troubling her. It was something else, a very familiar feeling. The girl rose from her bed, and now she was a real child, because all she could think about was food. All she could think about was yum, 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 which meant it's time to find something edible, LeBlanc knew it was crucial. She needed something to eat. She even started sucking her thumb. She was so hungry she couldn't even think clearly. LeBlanc was definitely beginning to imagine what the future held for her if she didn't get some food now. She could already picture the maid loudly exclaiming, "Little one, little one!" Another of the maids will think for a moment and say, "What should we do now, since the little girl won't wake up for some reason?" The third maid will definitely say, "Maybe we should just let her sleep a little longer. After all, she's just a child, and that's probably why she sleeps so long." At the same time, LeBlanc decided that if she didn't get a quick snack, she would turn into a whining little child, acting up and screaming loudly in her bed. Now, sitting on her bed at night, LeBlanc cried bitterly, then sobbed even louder, deciding that it would be a real shame if she turned into a small, eternally crying child. She knew that when she lost her mind from hunger, she became a burden, so she decided that she needed to go find something to eat, and for this purpose, she opened the door to the room. She knew she shouldn't be wandering around at night, but her empty stomach was more important, so she jumped up and ran down the corridor as fast as she could, wanting to find something to eat. She ran as fast as she could, trying to get as quickly as possible toward the kitchen, where, of course, there was bound to be something tasty. She knew for sure that she shouldn't wander around at night, but still, her hunger was stronger. And even stronger was the fear of being unwanted, because she would be a capricious and constantly crying girl. After all, in that case, she would never be able to adhere to adult logic. She would end up behaving like a child. Suddenly, she remembered her previous life in the Valen mansion, when she had been barefoot and half-naked for several days, locked in the attic. She remembered being unable to bear her hunger any longer and eating whatever she could get her hands on. She wasn't averse to any food and eventually burst into the kitchen and started munching on potatoes. She remembered the shame of Duke Valan's maids crowding over her head and calling her a beggar for simply running for food. She was ashamed, of course, but she couldn't help herself and was just trying to fill her stomach so she could think more clearly and not turn into a little child again. She remembered the time she died of hunger. It was terrifying. She was sitting somewhere near a gateway, and a woman with a child was walking nearby. And at that moment, she asked him if the food was tasty. LeBlanc still vividly remembered the delicacies this boy had carried in his hand. She would have given everything for food, but at the same time, it was unattainable. In the end, the most terrible thing happened. She was in tears from hunger at the gateway, and hunger overwhelmed her. LeBlanc was constantly shaking from the fear of being hungry. She was starting to panic, thinking that if she didn't get something to eat now, she'd turn into a child again. She just needed to eat something. That's why the girl ran as fast as she could towards the kitchen, with the intention of finding something edible there as quickly as possible. Finally, she ran there and opened the door a little, wanting to see if there was anything there, even something tasteless, but simply edible to satisfy her hunger. Memories of her former life and reality were jumbled in LeBlanc's head. She couldn't think clearly or logically and kept pacing the hallway, wondering if there was anything she needed in the kitchen. Afterwards, she remembered how, in her previous life, she'd been starving and searching for something edible hidden under the bed or closet. She was bitter about these memories, and she didn't want them to happen again. LeBlanc continued on her way again, pushing away her evil thoughts and hoping that her night's journey would not be in vain. She walked up to the door and grabbed the door handle. The girl walked up the steps into the room and began looking around to see if there was anyone unfamiliar there and if there was anything edible. When she burst into the kitchen, her attention immediately fell on the table where the food was being prepared. There was exactly what she was looking for: a loaf of bread. LeBlanc was overjoyed. Her eyes sparkling and her mouth already dripping with drool, she grabbed the loaf of bread with both hands. The girl was overjoyed to find some bread. She grabbed the loaf and decided to return to her room with it. She needed to get back to her room quickly and eat. She knew there might be trouble for walking around in the middle of the night. LeBlanc was trying to run so fast that she didn't notice anything beneath her feet. That's why she hit something painfully with her whole body. Her head began to ache from the bruise she'd sustained. Then she looked up and noticed someone or something towering over her, their shadow now completely blocking her from the light. She realized her midnight trip to the kitchen hadn't gone unnoticed. The young Duke looked at her sternly, as if asking what she was doing there. LeBlanc realized it was Duke Dublon. She was simply terrified, unsure what this villain might do next. A look of mute terror froze on her lips, and she seemed ready to scream. It looked like a real storm was about to break. The Duke was as dark as a thundercloud and looked sternly at the girl at his feet. LeBlanc still couldn't get over it. She turned away from the Duke and covered the loaf of bread with her body. She was deeply ashamed, but she didn't know how to escape unnoticed. After this, the girl decided to at least make sure the Duke didn't notice the bread. She fell on her stomach and hid the loaf with her body. Tears appeared on her face, but she still didn't want to be disgraced. She decided this was her last day in this house. Now the Duke would definitely throw her out like a thief. Well, perhaps this was her fate, and it couldn't be changed. It was at that moment that she remembered a story Mila had once told her. It was a well-known story in her world. The girl said that after Jean Valjean was caught stealing bread, something terrible happened. This particular story of the bread theft was particularly painful for LeBlanc. She remembered Mila's face when she told the story of the bread theft. She'd smiled, even though there was nothing to smile about. The girl remembered that in the end, the bread thief was executed, and she already imagined her head on the guillotine after the Duke learned of her misdeed. That is why LeBlanc now hid the bread under her body and trembled, trying to understand how she could save herself from shame and death. She imagined how ominous the Duke's eye would look when this villain asked her, "What were you doing in my mansion just now?" LeBlanc's only thought was not to die. She didn't want to die like this, in disgrace because of theft. It would have been better for her to die of hunger, as before. After this, Duke Doublon asked her, "What is the reason for your clever thinking then? How do you manage to know everything? Perhaps you are a spy for the Dowager Empress?" Duke Doublon loomed over her, waiting for her answer. After a moment's thought, he asked, "Perhaps you truly are a child of fate?" LeBlanc raised her eyes, looking at the Duke's knees. She didn't know what to say, for she was neither the Empress's spy nor a child of fate. That's why she decided to resort to a completely different defense. She began to sob loudly and began to cry, bursting into tears. Duke Doublon lightly scratched his chin and then quietly said that she needed to be completely honest. He then added that he hated those who lied to him, especially those who feigned innocence with petty lies. The Duke touched his cheek again, and after a short pause, asked either the girl or someone else what he should do with the small rat. LeBlanc raised her head, and still bursting into tears and looking into the Duke's face, began to beg his forgiveness. She was deeply ashamed, deeply afraid. Duke Doublon looked at the girl with unexpected interest. He asked her why she was asking him for forgiveness. Meanwhile, LeBlanc was sitting on the floor, shaking all over. Then, in a stammering, incoherent voice, she said, I stole." The young man leaned over the girl sitting on the floor, looked into her eyes, and asked again if she had really stolen money from him. The little girl remembered being asked something similar in a past life. Back then, she'd been asked about a holy relic. Then they asked her if she had perhaps stolen some military secrets, but the girl remained silent. After this, Duke Doublon could no longer bear it and shouted very loudly, "Tell me finally, what are you apologizing for, and what did you steal?" After this, LeBlanc could no longer remain silent. She snatched up the loaf of bread and, crying, held it out in front of her with both hands. Then, stuttering, she said, "I stole the bread." The young man looked at the girl in confusion. He couldn't understand how anyone could steal bread. In front of him was a little girl, holding out a loaf of bread to him with trembling hands. The library was quite quiet. The bookcases were filled to the brim with books. There were so many that it seemed they had been collected from all over the country. All the maids and servants had gathered in the library. The girls, nearly in tears, stood before their master, awaiting a severe punishment. Standing before everyone was the girl the little lady particularly liked and loved more than anyone else. Tears were streaming down her face, and she was on the verge of bursting into tears. A little girl sat in a chair. She had a bun in her hand, and now, with tears in her eyes, she gnawed on it and wondered what awaited her next. Opposite her, in a chair, leaning on his knee, sat the young Duke of Doublon, watching how greedily the girl devoured the food. The sweet maid bowed before her master and began to justify herself. But first, she decided to justify the young mistress, so she said the girl had gone to bed early and taken the bread left by the servants. The Duke looked at her incredulously and asked if this meant the girl had found the bread left by the servants. There seemed to be a note of disbelief in his voice. Lydia stood before her master, unsure of what to say. Behind her stood the other maids, and the one in charge of refreshments was ashamed of what had just happened. The Duke fell silent and sank into deep thought again. He sat there, pondering something, unable to yell at the maid or the other maids. After this, the young man extended his hand forward towards the young lady. The next moment, Leblanc saw a hand reaching out to her. The girl became startled, jumped up, and immediately climbed into the arms of the maid standing nearby. The Duke did not understand what had happened, why the girl had jumped up so abruptly and climbed into the maid's arms. After that, the man spoke. He was curious, so he asked the girls why the girl was acting like this when just a few hours ago she was still clinging to him, but now she was afraid of even the slightest movement from him. A servant standing nearby said that, in his opinion, the girl was very frightened by the situation and was now afraid that she would be punished. Leaning against the girl's neck, Leblanc continued to cry loudly. She knew it wasn't because she was afraid of the Duke. She simply couldn't calm down until she had something to eat. Besides, she was sure that she felt completely safe next to Duke Dublon, but at that moment, she really thought that she could be killed for stealing bread. That's why, out of fear of death, she pressed herself against the girl's chest, wept loudly, and awaited her fate. Meanwhile, the maid watched her closely, unsure how to help. For a moment, Lydia thought that, if necessary, she would be ready to defend the small child in her arms with her own breast. The other maids were equally ready to protect their mistress. Lydia felt like no one else could do it. She looked proudly into her master's face, ready to withstand any reproach, and then said, "Since the child needs a good meal, I'll take her and feed her." The other girls hadn't expected such behavior from her. Their mouths dropped open in surprise, unable to believe she'd responded so boldly to her master. The young Duke's face seemed to suddenly change color. His eyes gleamed with anger, as if a real storm was about to break out. The poor girls expected the worst. Knowing their master's evil nature, they thought Lydia would inevitably face punishment for her insolence and disobedience. But things turned out completely differently than they had expected. Duke Dublon quickly calmed down and then uttered just one word. "Excellent!" After this, all the maids, and in front of them a girl with a child in her arms, hurried out of the library as quickly as possible before their master changed his mind. Even after they were outside the door, Lydia thought there would definitely be retribution for her words and her courage. She even said she thought death was coming for her. Meanwhile, other girls began praising her. One said Lydia was the best, another called her a tough fighter. Only little Leblanc didn't know what to do now. When they put her down on the floor, she apologized in her slurred voice for being hungry and leaving her room. The girls approached her and immediately began to calm her down. They said there was nothing wrong with what she did. Lydia leaned over, hugged the girl, and said, "You shouldn't talk like that, my lady. Children need plenty of food and plenty of sleep." At that moment, Leblanc realized that for the first time in her life, someone truly loved her. For the first time, someone felt sorry for her and treated her with such kindness. She thought it was so nice here, and she just wanted to live. Her only desire was to live, and to live in this very place, because it seemed like this really was a true paradise. The weather has been wonderful these past few days. It's been warm enough, but not too hot. And, thankfully, there's been no rain. A few days after the night's incident, almost everyone had forgotten about it. The maids were busy cleaning the hallway. As soon as they saw the young mistress, they immediately began to greet her. Leblanc ran past them like a whirlwind and wished them good morning. One could tell that her daily life was gradually beginning to improve. But suddenly, the girl stopped, and looking at the obstacle in front of her, raised her head. Directly before her stood the young Duke of Dublon, and behind him stood his faithful assistant. The man looked directly into the face of his charge. The girl wondered if something terrible was about to happen. She needed to act, so she said she was a little busy right now. She looked into the Duke's face and decided that if there was a serious conversation to be had now, the best course of action would be to avoid crossing paths with him, and then she might not be thrown out. But suddenly, the command to stop sounded. Shaking all over, Leblanc stopped and began to wait for what might be bad news. Duke Dublon was saddened to see that something was wrong with the girl. He didn't like that she was still frightened and afraid of him. An aide standing behind him advised him to call the girl by her name. Perhaps that would help. Leblanc heard this and sighed deeply. She told herself it probably wouldn't help. It wasn't such good advice. Besides, she was sure the Duke didn't know her name. The young man pierced the little girl with his icy gaze and then ordered her to follow him. Since LeBlanc was resisting this in every possible way and did not want to go, the assistant standing behind her was forced to push her slightly. The young Duke approached the door of his study. There he paused, and with a slight sideways glance, glanced back to see if his adopted daughter was following him. Since the girl was in no hurry, the man turned around, opened his mouth, and said that if she followed him, he would promise to give her something. LeBlanc didn't know what to do. She was afraid to follow the Duke, but at the same time, the offer of something intrigued her. She wondered what he would give her, so she moved a little closer to the door. But the Duke had already entered inside, and only his hand remained outside. The girl didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she was sure there was nothing there, and she wanted to go back. But she was still curious about what the Duke had. She thought that, perhaps, as soon as she entered this room, the evil Duke would immediately give orders to his assistant to lock her there so that she would not cause any more trouble, and they would write on the door that there was a dangerous child here. She was a little scared by her fantasy and began to wonder if they really wanted to lock her in. She didn't want that at all. At the same time, the assistant approached Duke Dublon and laughed. When the Duke asked what was wrong, he replied that it seemed the girl was still frightened. The Duke wondered why the girl was still afraid. He couldn't understand the reason for her fear, as he treated her with the utmost kindness. After this, the Duke left the room, approached the girl, looked into her face, and called her by name, LeBlanc. The little girl raised her head in surprise and stared intently into the Duke's face. After all, he knew her name. Besides knowing her name, he had something else in his palm. The Duke extended his hand with candy toward the girl and added that there were mountains of more. These sweets looked so tempting, and if the Duke was to believe that there were even more of them inside, then she would gladly go there. It seemed she couldn't resist any longer. There was only candy in her eyes. There was candy in her head, and even drool suddenly began to flow from her mouth. LeBlanc didn't know what to do. She stood in front of the door, flanked by two men, and looked into the room. It seemed no one was trying to deceive her. Indeed, the room was filled with a wide variety of sweets. There were not only candies, but also baked goods. The Duke hadn't lied to her. With her eyes and mouth wide open, the girl immediately burst into the room shouting, "Yes!" After that, she plopped down on the floor, face first in the sweets. She couldn't believe her luck. It seemed like heaven on earth. Behind her stood the surprised Duke of Dublon and his smiling assistant, watching the little girl who couldn't believe her luck. LeBlanc immediately stuffed her mouth with candy and decided that this was very similar to a moment from a fairy tale, because she ran here without even thinking about anything. After that, she decided it would be unfair to eat all this alone. She stood up from her seat, picked up a sweet in her hand, and held it out toward the Duke. The young Duke of Dublon looked at her in surprise, not understanding what she wanted. After this, the young man thought for a moment, scratched his chin, and told the girl that she was very strange and that her actions seemed quite unusual. With her mouth full, the girl could only mutter, "What?" as if asking what he'd said. The young man patted her cheek and said it looked like a squirrel's. LeBlanc responded by thinking she'd forgive him for saying that, since he was the boss here. She looked at the man leaning over her and decided that she would build a good relationship with the Duke so that he would no longer dare to say such things. The girl decided to show him the strength of a person already living her fourth life. So she rushed to Duke Dublon and said, "Thank you, Duke." The young man smiled and looked at his charge. He was satisfied. He liked the way his daughter responded to the treat. The Duke's little daughter needed to get ready, but she couldn't choose a dress. Several maids stood before her, holding her outfits. LeBlanc finally calmed down after the bread incident. Truly peaceful days had arrived, though it seemed something was brewing. She was calmly eating a candy when she was called. It was Lydia, and she looked very angry. She told the girl that she had promised to eat only one candy, and this was already her seventh, and that her teeth would rot and fall out. She caught her eating the sweets and became very angry. Some time later, one of the court nobles came to her with a gift. He gave her a beautiful handbag in the shape of an elephant. The butler had purchased it especially for the girl. LeBlanc immediately hung her purse on her back and then turned to the maids with the words, "Sisters, aren't I a cutie?" The maids absolutely loved the bag. They exclaimed with delight and declared that their young lady looked absolutely adorable. But a plan had already formed in the little mischief maker's head. She decided that this handbag was ideal for a secret storage place. But eventually, her carefree life came to an end. Now she was dressed in a beautiful dress, and she asked the maids why. Lily laughed and told the girl that today was an unusual day, and today she was to be introduced to the Duke's vassals. The maids picked her up and began explaining that there would be many people in the palace today, and that they would likely faint when they realized how sweet their young mistress was. They also added that the sponsors' children might be there too. The girl didn't understand what the word sponsors meant. The empire's sponsorship system was rather peculiar. It was a traditional system of social support among the aristocracy when rich people took poor but talented children under their wing. But in essence, it was a system for finding a true genius among children. Aristocrats were engaged in raising gifted children in accordance with their own family ideals. Children who received sponsorship could receive permission for state support, but to do so they had to demonstrate their abilities. Systematic education based on accumulated data was rather unfair, but still, truly talented and capable students were often found among the children. Among them were also the children of sponsors. All of this included massive financial support for children who demonstrated talent and special abilities. That's why it was considered prestigious among aristocratic families. Leblon reflected that even now, provincial aristocrats received sponsorship from large dynasties who were interested in finding talented children. After this, Lily, who had stepped forward in front of the maids, approached her and said, "Come with me, lady," and extended her hand to her. The girl took her hand and thought that if this was the Dublon house, then their children must be incredibly talented. The girl thought for a moment and decided that she was very interested in who it would be and what amazing children she might meet. They walked down the corridor, flooded with bright sunlight that came in through the windows. Then she saw someone's feet, clad in boots. The person had his back to her, and she couldn't figure out who they belonged to. Leblon thought there was already someone there, and it seemed they weren't just regular palace residents, but someone who had come here specifically. She hurried into the hall, holding her maid's hand. A boy stood in the middle of the hall, surrounded by adults. He greeted the men standing around him and said, "Hello, Count Dubon, Count Martin, Baron Lux." One of the men replied that young Lord Jude was getting smarter every day, having memorized so many names. Noticing the others looking at the boy with interest, Leblon decided she should show off in front of these people, who were now starting to look her way. Coming closer to the men, the girl curtsied, grasping the hem of her dress with her palms, and greeted those present. The men immediately began eyeing the young lady approvingly. Someone said she was charming, another asked who this cutie was, and everyone talked about emulating this sweet lady, but the boy didn't seem at all pleased that they'd lost interest in him. He looked at the new guest in surprise and said, "What?" And now the young lady looked with interest at some boy who stood in front of her and looked at her with the same surprise and intrigue. Suddenly, Leblon thought he looked rather familiar. She felt as if she'd met this boy in some previous life. Looking at how slyly and insolently this boy smiled, she was sure that she knew him from somewhere. She recalled one of her past lives, when she was much older. Back then, this man had been one of those terrible people she'd met. His name was Marco Jude, and it happened when she was attending the academy as the daughter of Duke Volin. She remembered that red-haired young man when he saw her and said, "Oh, Lady Leblon Volin, could you come into my office?" At the time, this man was a professor at the Volan Family Academy. Leaning over her, he said, "Your grades this semester are simply excellent." This young man constantly haunted Leblon in her former life. He dreamed of nothing more than becoming the Duke's son-in-law and behaved utterly disgustingly, offering her his services to improve her grades. Leblon was not going to tolerate his antics, and, as soon as he tried to approach her, she gave him a resounding slap in the face. She couldn't stand it any longer and reported it to the appropriate authorities. But this impudent man twisted the whole situation and blamed the innocent girl for everything. Marco loudly declared for all to hear that it was Leblon who seduced him. He explained this by saying that, if he really thought about it, if the girl didn't like it, why did she put up with it for so long? He asked other people these questions and found support in them. Thus, the girl was falsely accused of seducing the teacher, and everyone condemned her. After all, the victim often doesn't understand what's happening when the person in front of them is significantly older. The man, 10 years her senior, took the stand and declared he had no intentions. He even shouted in her face, "If you didn't like it, why didn't you say anything?" The girl shook with fear and anger after his words that she was supposedly fine with everything. She was completely terrified and couldn't utter a word in response. She was so terrified that she couldn't scream or cry. Her words were dismissed as empty excuses, and he merely received a 6-month salary cut. LeBlanc, however, was kicked out of the academy. Nevertheless, slander continued to haunt her, and after her expulsion from school, her life changed. And then she was reborn again and found herself in this life. Now the boy stood in front of the table where the men were sitting. One of them asked, "So what do we have for the day before?" Another replied that everything had already been listed. LeBlanc was beside herself with rage. The mere thought of that man made her want to punch him in the face, but she was forced to calm down, realizing that this boy was just a child. If she hit him now, her reputation would be in tatters. She shouldn't make mistakes. At the same time, the red-haired boy stated that he had developed several new formulas together with his mentor. When people started asking him if he was already at that level and saying it was incredible, LeBlanc decided the boy was simply a liar. After all, even at the academy, he had been known for his stupidity. She once caught him talking to his father, who was asking him how to solve a problem. The girl thought about it. She understood that his father had taken care of everything. It was exactly like that. He wasn't a genius. They simply paid a real scientist to create all those formulas for him. After this, the boy sat down on the sofa with a satisfied face next to the puzzled and uncomfortable LeBlanc. He smiled slyly and maliciously and asked if the girl sitting next to him had seen how he had gotten around them all. LeBlanc didn't answer him back, but only asked in surprise, "What?" At this point, Marco, for some reason, began turning his head from side to side, as if trying to find someone. The girl looked at him in surprise. After this, the boy leaned towards the girl and in an angry, creaky voice said quietly, so that no one could hear, "Someone like you can't defeat me, you liar!" Afterward, LeBlanc thought, does this kid really want to compete with a 4-year-old? Does he really think I'm just another sponsored kid? She decided to simply ignore the smirking boy sitting next to her. She began to silently pray to Buddha, thinking that she just needed to calm down. At that moment, the phrase, "You're just pathetic," reached her ears. It was said by the boy sitting next to her. After this, smiling maliciously, he continued and said that everyone was saying that the Dowager Empress had thrown this girl out into the so-called trash heap of the Dukes of Dublin. The boy's mouth twisted into a pitiful grin. He added that trash should remain trash. The girl remembered her past life. Back then, she was a very naive, stupid girl who knew nothing. A naive toy, frightened and abandoned. She thought she was a girl then, incapable of uttering a word in response to insults. But now everything was going to be different. She decided she had to act. Otherwise, she couldn't tolerate all this bullying. After all, she had already faced 3 deaths and was now living her 4th life. So, with all her might, she punched the boy right in the cheek. Hearing the sound of the blow and the boy's scream, many men in the hall immediately turned their heads towards the children. The poor maids and servants were simply stunned by what had happened and froze in mute horror. But the girl did not calm down and continued to deliver resounding blows, first to the left, then to the right, carrying out quick combinations. A moment later, the enemy was defeated and fell to the floor with a broken nose. She thought the boy would regret his words. As expected, the winner was already known. The other maids rejoiced that their young lady had won the competition. As expected, she proved much stronger than the boy. A moment later, she saw a man running and shouting loudly, "How dare you!" Judging by the external resemblance, it was the father of the defeated boy. The others present in the room looked on in amazement. They couldn't understand what could have driven the girl to act like this. The boy's father ran up to him and began to lift him from the floor, asking if he was all right. It was Baron Jude, Marco's father. The boy held his bruised cheek and said that for some reason this crazy woman hit him. LeBlanc wasn't about to remain silent in response to these accusations. She repeated several times in her slurred voice, "You're a bad child! You're a bad child!" The Duke's courtiers watched the unfolding scene in amazement. They couldn't understand what had suddenly happened. When asked what it all meant, the girl pointed at the beaten boy and said that he had claimed that she was trash thrown into the Dublon landfill. A silent scene ensued. The girl pointed at the boy, and his father sat next to him, stunned by her words. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. LeBlanc looked back in surprise at the maids and nobles standing there. She couldn't understand why they were acting like this. Had she really been wrong, and now he could report her for beating her, and she'd be in big trouble. At this point, the maids and retainers were very upset. They thought it was all their fault and asked if the young lady was angry with them. They continued to call her Little Angel. The girl didn't understand what it meant, because she just hit Marco in the face. Marco seemed to recover from the shock and beating and shouted loudly, "That's not true! Why are you slandering me? You're a bad girl and a real liar!" At this point, the master of the house suddenly intervened. Duke Dublon approached and addressed the boy, saying he had insulted a child under his protection. The boy's father began to justify himself and stated that he had simply misspoke, since he was just a child. Then he leaned against his son with a tight smile and added that his boy would never call the Dublon family a dump. His words only angered the young master of the house. He declared that since the father was protecting his son, he was willing to give the boy one last chance. After this, the man approached the boy, looked him straight in the face and said, "Even if your eyes are burned out or your hands are cut off, you will still be able to say that your words are just a mistake." The young Duke of Dublon's eyes gleamed predatorily. He added that the scene the boy had created before his eyes was as foolish as he was. The boy looked with fear at the man looming over him, who said that he couldn't prove that his words were just a slip of the tongue. After this, the Duke straightened up and asked, "I ask again, were the words spoken by my child true or false?" LeBlanc watched in amazement. No matter how cunning Marco was, he wouldn't dare lie to Duke Dublon. She desperately wanted to believe it. The boy hung his head and was forced to admit that it was all true. The girl had told the truth, and he had lied. After this, Baron Jude, Marco's father, began to shake his son by the shoulders, saying that he might have made a mistake. The man broke out in a sweat. His face turned red, and he glanced sideways in fear at the owner of the house. Then he grabbed the Duke by the clothes, fell on his knees before him, and began to beg for mercy, saying that his son had committed a grave sin. The Duke looked at him proudly and told him to go away, then turned around, not wanting to talk to the Baron anymore. After some time, the heavy footsteps of the guards were heard entering the room. The knights grabbed the Baron by the armpits and dragged him away, resisting and begging for mercy. They dragged his negligent son away after him. After this, silence reigned in the ducal palace. Everyone pondered what had happened, but after some time, the vassals began to praise the girl. They called her truly charming, said it was simply wonderful to watch the young lady stand up to the evil boy, and added that she had explained the situation beautifully. LeBlanc thought it seemed like all these people hadn't understood the true meaning of her words. After all, the boy had told her not to act so presumptuous. She wished it were the other way around, that he'd hit her, and she'd reply, "Oh, how rude you are! I'm just a guest here. I can't cause trouble and quarrels. That's my miserable fate." And the boy would then say, "In short, the Dublon family is pure trash." That's exactly what he said. The girl thought it wouldn't be so scary if this boy insulted her personally, but he dared to insult the entire Dublon family. He behaved like a real jerk. That's exactly why he should be punished. That is why she dealt him several crushing blows, and thus the impudent and harmful boy was punished. All this flashed through her mind. She wanted everything to be exactly this way. Therefore, she should think only positive thoughts, because good thoughts are the key to health. Looking at the people standing around her, she thought they were the Duke's closest aides. She'd shown herself to be on her best side, and it was best to leave it at that. The girl turned around to look at the Duke of Dublon. She thought that perhaps the Duke liked her. After all, he had sided with her during the argument. She saw a hand extended to her, and someone called her cutie. But, as before, she was terrified. Seeing someone trying to touch her, she screamed loudly and decided to run away. The man who extended his hand toward her was very surprised and stunned by the girl's behavior. He couldn't understand why she suddenly became so afraid of him. Others immediately began to reassure him, asking if he didn't know the child was afraid of grown men. Someone else added that the girl only felt safe around His Grace the Duke. Another said she simply liked the Duke. Duke Dublon, who heard all this, only uttered a short phrase. Well, there you go. The girl paused. This whole thing was causing her so much trouble. She wondered if she'd made a mistake when she just heard the man say that, but she thought it was a little unfair. But, as the saying goes, after dark days come bright ones. One such day came when the girl was finally able to get out into the city. Striding down the street, LeBlanc looked at the houses and store shelves. She was having a great time strolling through the city. Next to her was her favorite maid, Lydia, who had just asked her if she was glad she was allowed out into the city. The girl immediately replied, "Of course." People used to think of her as a burden, but now everything had changed. No one ignored her anymore, and everyone paid attention to her. She thought that was why she should go into a store and do some shopping. At this time, the city was in a real state of celebration. Joy reigned everywhere, and clowns performed in the streets. There were many people with children. The little ones were eating cotton candy and ice cream. Charming ladies were sitting in cafes under umbrellas, sheltering from the scorching sun. LeBlanc walked down the street, smiling sweetly. She felt at home at this celebration of life, not an outsider, as she had in previous lives. Suddenly, she stopped in front of a store window. The girl saw that it was the very store she remembered from her past life, and it was here that she had been yearning to go. There she noticed a familiar toy, which had just been released around that year. It was a plush toy that was incredibly popular in its day. Children adored it, and it seemed as if the toy loved them back. LeBlanc remembered that if you hug this bunny tightly, it says the words, "I love you." The girl remembered that in her first life, this bunny had been incredibly popular. Back then, she couldn't afford anything like it. She remembered standing at the display case and saying, "Daddy, I want that toy." Hearing this, her father then replied, "If you donate money to the starving people, instead of buying this toy, you will save their lives." The girl clearly remembered him kneeling next to her and saying those words. Then he asked her if she really wanted the toy that badly. He held her hand, and she really wanted to get the bunny, but she still quietly answered, "No." Hearing this, the father said that his daughter was a very good girl, and that today, instead of a plush toy, she would receive attention and fame. At that moment, LeBlanc felt as if she were reliving that scene from her past life. She felt very sad. To be honest, she really wanted this toy back then. But later, when she was already 18, it was Mila who received it from her father, and, laughing loudly, exclaimed, "Thank you, Daddy." Seeing Mila thank him so joyfully and cheerfully, the Duke was overjoyed. He was much happier than when LeBlanc donated money to the starving instead of a toy. At that moment, the girl mentally ordered herself not to think about what had happened to her before, and shook her head. The maid standing next to her turned to the young lady with a smile and said that since she was there for the first time, she might want to buy something. LeBlanc also smiled sweetly at her companion. The girl seemed to think she was simply shy, as she was looking at the ground. Lily was very kind to her, as were the other maids. They took great care of the girl and tried to treat her to something tasty every time. When they entered the cafe, the girl said that the young lady could choose whatever she wanted here. The girl was simply at a loss. Every time she was offered something, the other maids happily supported her and told her she could take anything, calling her a cutie. LeBlanc looked around with interest. She didn't know what to choose. She felt like she wanted everything at once, and her eyes darted in all directions. But suddenly, her face changed, as if she remembered something. Confused, she headed in the other direction, and there she found something. She saw a red carnation in a shop window. LeBlanc thought for a moment. She reflected that, come to think of it, Thanksgiving was approaching. Thanksgiving was a complex holiday. Its symbol was, in fact, the red carnation. On this day, parents received a gift from their children, and this particular flower became such a gift. It was a day when children gave their parents a carnation as a special sign of gratitude. LeBlanc thought it would be nice to buy this carnation and give it to someone, but she still had some doubts. She saw other toys that seemed to say to her, "You can play with us a lot. You will have more fun with us." And they seemed to call out, "Buy me, buy me." The girl was completely confused. On the one hand, she really wanted a toy, but the carnation also intrigued her. Eventually, LeBlanc decided that she couldn't pass up such an opportunity and decided to take action. When she said she wanted a carnation, Lily suddenly and puzzledly asked the girl if she was sure about that. The girl thought it was just a carnation brooch and said the children at the orphanage had said, "Give this flower to someone you like." She decided she wanted to give the carnation as a gift. Lily noted with puzzlement that Thanksgiving was indeed coming soon. At that moment, LeBlanc remembered Lily. After all, if you give her a carnation, she'll probably give you some candy. At first, the girl thought about giving the carnation to the Duke of Dublon, but then she remembered how he said, "You're something else," and she began to doubt it. She began to shake her head, thinking that she shouldn't spoil his mood with such a meaningless gift. At that moment, the girl next to her said that they would then come back and buy the brooch. The girl immediately agreed. As they approached the house, LeBlanc thought that as soon as they returned, she would give Lily a flower, as she was not expecting such a surprise at all. Finally, they reached the palace. There she noticed several courtiers walking down the corridor. One of the men wore a carnation in his buttonhole. The person walking next to him noticed this and said, "Oh, it's a stud brooch." When the man was asked if he had received it from his daughter, he laughed loudly and replied that he had indeed received it. Then he began to tell her story and said that his daughter had given it to him in honor of the following Thanksgiving. And then he understood the meaning of a happy life, because there is nothing better than the joy of children. The men continued discussing the gift. Someone said that, frankly, no honor or wealth could compare to a gift from one's own child. Duke Dublon heard all this. He also heard the words that nothing could truly compare to this. He became intrigued by the vassal's conversation. Noticing the Duke, the men turned to him, and one of them said that His Grace the Duke would undoubtedly be pleased to receive such a gift. After all, if a person isn't pleased, they're most likely heartless. Besides, it's a shame for those who've never received a carnation. The Duke looked at the men talking and said bitterly that he most likely would not understand this. The men looked at their overlord in bewilderment and asked him why he thought so. The Duke of Dublon replied that no one had ever given him a carnation and most likely never would again. The young man asked his master again why no one had ever given him this flower. Another added that even with the Duke's 3 sons, no one ever gave him a carnation. The third thought that even if the Dublon family was known to be heartless, this was still a bit much. One of the assistants almost burst into tears when he heard that his master had never even received a carnation. After this, the young man said that their master was simply not very interested in holidays and was used to expressing everything in words. Then Duke Dublon added that he had never heard words of gratitude from his children. The men felt very sorry for their master. The longer the conversation went on, the more upset they became and the more sympathetic they became to the Duke. At that moment, they noticed Lily walking down the corridor, with little LeBlanc walking next to her, holding a carnation in her hand. Everyone immediately noticed the flower in the girl's hand and seemed to have come to the same thought. They were delighted to see the carnation and almost cried out with joy. They immediately hurried to Duke Dublon and asked him to look in that direction, saying that there was a carnation there and that now his lordship would finally receive this flower. The Duke also turned his head in that direction and stared coldly at the girl walking towards him. LeBlanc also glanced toward the Duke. For some reason, she suddenly became strangely sad, her eyes never leaving her adopted father. Then she paused, looking at the man standing before her. It seemed as if something important was about to happen. The men standing nearby thought the girl was giving the carnation she'd bought for the Duke. It seemed the flower was intended specifically for him. The young man smiled slightly, looking at the girl. The men seemed to have already convinced him that he was about to receive a carnation, and he was very happy about it. The men leaned toward the girl and began asking if she would like to give them a carnation since she had come. Another remarked that it would be best to do so right now. LeBlanc looked at the flower in her hand and wondered if she should do it. After all, it was the first time she'd given someone a carnation, and besides, Duke Dublon hadn't accepted it. She took the jewelry in both hands and held it out in front of her. But, to the surprise of everyone present, the girl handed the carnation not to the Duke, but towards the also very surprised Lily. She held out the flower and said to the girl, "Thank you, Lily. I like you." While Lily stared in surprise at the flower in the girl's hand, the men nearby couldn't hide their horror. They waited to see what the Duke would do next. Duke Dublon's face turned strangely pale, then darkened. His eyes gleamed angrily. It seemed as if something terrible was about to happen. The vassals were terribly frightened. They were already prepared to face punishment, thinking they couldn't have known the girl would give a flower to a servant. At this time, Lily grabbed the girl by the hands and began to spin around with her right in front of everyone. After this, she sat down in front of her with a flower in her hand and said, "Thank you, young lady. I will cherish this gift." Hearing these words, LeBlanc immediately threw herself on her neck and hugged the maid. But at the same time, she wondered why a chill suddenly ran down her spine. At that moment, the loud voice of the young duke was heard from behind, calling her by name. The girl turned around in fear and quietly asked, "Yes?" The young man asked his daughter if she had a gift for him too. The girl smiled broadly and answered loudly, "Yes, he's not here." Unfortunately, she hadn't bought him a gift because she'd decided he wouldn't be interested in such trivial things. So why would he need a carnation? The duke's expression changed. He looked at the smiling girl and maid and literally seethed with anger. That same day, Thanksgiving was cancelled throughout the Duchy of Dublin. It appears LeBlanc was the unwitting cause of this, but time moved on. The girl continued to enjoy life and now plopped down on her bed. Lily was wiping the window pane at the time. A red carnation brooch, a gift from a young lady, was pinned to her chest. The girl treasured it very much and had not taken it off since she received it. Looking at this, LeBlanc thought, "Did Lily really like my gift that much? She's so protective of this carnation." At that moment, the young duke's assistant appeared and told the girl that it was time for them to go to the duke's office. LeBlanc immediately jumped up and said she was ready to go. Today, she would have to tell the Dowager Empress how things were going. The young man smiled slightly and remarked to the young lady that she was very energetic today. After this, the two of them, along with their assistant, walked down the corridor towards the duke's office. On the way, the girl noticed servants carrying some cardboard boxes. She suddenly became curious about what they were. The young man explained that they were preparing a banquet in honor of the birthday of His Majesty the Emperor. LeBlanc looked at him in surprise and thought that if that was the case, then nobles everywhere should now be preparing gifts for the emperor, and the duke was no exception. Even Duke Amiti, who was indifferent to the imperial family's favor, always prepared a gift. The dukes of Midi and Valan were even worse, but they still spent money to prepare a gift. However, the money was spent on all sorts of trinkets. Their stinginess was especially evident in her. One day, without realizing it, she bought herself a simple pen. After that, she was severely punished. They called her a damn parasite who was robbing someone else's house. They pulled her hair painfully and sent her to the attic, telling her not to even dare come out, the little brat. So she ended up in the attic. Meanwhile, the other children in the family asked if they weren't allowed to buy pens too. The second boy responded that parents don't like it when LeBlanc buys school supplies, but that doesn't apply to them. The younger boy asked why LeBlanc had been scolded then. His brother replied that she was a complete stranger here, already leaving for his rooms and moving away from the attic. He added that she was not at all a natural child in this family. The girl understood that she was hated there precisely because she was an adopted child, and she had to endure this pain. When she finally realized that as an adopted child, she was hated the most and beaten even for minor infractions, she decided that she had to do something to win the Duke's trust. The moment they knocked on the Duke's office door, LeBlanc thought that if she just sat there, he would never adopt her. Something had to be done. When they entered the office, Duke Dublin was sitting in his chair. He looked rather unusual because he was wearing glasses. LeBlanc immediately rushed towards him as fast as she could and shouted loudly, "Duke!" The man looked at her in surprise, slightly lifting his gaze from the sheet of paper in his hand, and then quietly hiccuped. Seeing that the man seemed to be ignoring her, LeBlanc hesitated and stopped. Her face flushed. After that, she decided to hide behind the young assistant's leg, thinking about what she had already done wrong. Seeing that the girl was frightened, the Duke's assistant leaned towards her and quietly whispered that, frankly speaking, the Duke was not at all angry with the young lady. He just had a lot of things to do right now. The girl decided that perhaps he was angry at someone else, but it was still unclear why the young Duke was in such a mood. She needed to find out. The assistant leaned toward the girl again and quietly said that next time she should prepare a gift for the Duke as well. A carnation, for example. This came as a complete surprise to LeBlanc. She suddenly realized she had made a serious mistake and was deeply upset. Most likely, the Duke had actually been expecting a gift from her. The girl's face immediately filled with tears. The money she'd spent on the gift belonged to the Duke of Dublon. So she'd spent his money without even buying him a gift. That was probably why he was angry. She looked at the man, who seemed to continue to ignore her, staring intently at the piece of paper in front of him. LeBlanc began to turn her head from side to side, trying to decide what to do. Maybe she should go and buy a gift urgently? But if she did that now, it would look like the Duke was upset, like a little child, because he didn't get a present. The girl decided she needed to give something much better than a regular gift. Maybe there was something useful in her memories? She needed to remember. She began to think hard and wondered if this would be suitable as a gift. She needed to think it through carefully. Then she remembered the stone that lay in the box and decided the Duke would surely be delighted. But why was there a perfectly ordinary, unremarkable stone inside the box? When she opened the box, she suddenly thought, "What is this?" Her eyes suddenly sparkled, and it seemed as if something around her was beginning to change. The stone inside the box suddenly glowed brightly and blinded the girl. She felt pain, as if something was penetrating right into her thoughts. Because of this bright light, she noticed the assistant's face suddenly darken strangely. He called her "baby" and asked what was going on. Duke Dublon's face also began to look very strange. He raised his head and asked what had happened. They seemed to have noticed something different too. The girl felt as if the sound was no longer reaching her ears, but was penetrating her mind directly. She wondered what the sound was and what exactly was approaching. LeBlanc suddenly felt as if she had fallen powerlessly to the ground, and everything around her began to melt and become unexpectedly soft. But then everything suddenly stopped. She saw the frightened face of the Duke's assistant, who asked, "Was that really an earthquake?" At this time, Duke Dublon jumped up from his seat and ordered that an exploration party be sent into the forest, because this could be a harbinger of a volcanic eruption. At this point, LeBlanc was completely out of her mind. She couldn't understand what had happened. The light suddenly went out, and it was as if something was swallowing her. What could it be? Could this have happened under the influence of the stone? She couldn't understand. Was her body moving on its own, and she had no control over it? The girl remembered very well how she took the stone in her hand, and then something completely unimaginable began to happen. The two men next to her looked equally confused. Both the Duke's young assistant and Duke Dublon himself couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Not knowing what to do, the girl began to pray, muttering in her baby talk, "Oh God! Oh God! Oh God!" She was so scared that she was now afraid to even move. Finally, the young assistant spoke up. He said it was most likely a Niyut. The girl became curious about what exactly the young man meant by the word Niyut. She began to ponder. She had heard so much about the Niyut in her past lives that she was already quite tired of it. It was a very rare item. They say the Niyut is the relic of an evil god. After this, the young man approached the Duke and declared that the young lady was innocent and there was no need to worry. In any case, the relic would soon turn to dust anyway. Duke Dublon spoke up and said that what had happened had caused them obvious problems and that something would have to be done about it. The girl was frightened and began to tremble all over. She began to apologize and say she hadn't meant to do anything bad. Her hands trembled constantly, and although the Duke had said she had caused a lot of trouble, he had then added that she shouldn't worry too much. But the girl was still afraid that instead of winning the Duke's trust, she had only ruined everything. After this, Duke Dublon sat back down in his chair and told her that she had enough of disturbing them, and that perhaps she should return to her room. But the next moment, the Duke jumped up from his seat, and the young assistant opened his mouth wide in fright and surprise. They saw the little girl in the office suddenly lose consciousness. She fell abruptly to the floor and went silent. The Duke came closer and began to look closely at his little pet. He couldn't figure out what had happened to her. At first glance, it seemed as if LeBlanc had simply fallen asleep. Her eyes were closed, but her breathing was strangely ragged. The girl herself felt as if she were sleeping and dreaming of someone standing with his back to her. From afar, she seemed to hear someone addressing her, calling her by name. Suddenly, she could see the face of a man standing with his back to her. It was the Duke of Amity, her kind, proper, and cautious father, whom she respected greatly. As his child, she had had to give up a lot, but it didn't seem like a big deal to her. Now he looked at her and called her by her name, Liblon. She suddenly realized the Duke was smiling when he said her name. However, there had always been an impenetrable wall between her and her father. Although the Duke of Amity gave her a room in his house, there was almost no real relationship between them. This man loved her in his own way. It was he who taught her the family's wisdom. In addition, they often sat together at the table and ate. He was a very inspiring, pleasant, and kind person. But, unfortunately, he never considered her his real daughter. Besides her, he had other daughters. When they addressed him as Daddy, he paid them almost no attention. Whenever LeBlanc tried to talk to the Duke, he often reminded her that she was too spoiled. She answered him, "How can I behave otherwise than like a spoiled daughter in front of my daddy?" It was completely different with Mila. With her, he became a completely different person. He was constantly smiling and very kind. The girl watched as his smile brightened when he saw Mila. He had never smiled like that around her. It seemed like nothing serious. It happens, but it still hurt. As a little girl, she was deeply offended by this attitude. But at the same time, she understood that she was not real, and that Mila was the Oracle's true child. After all, Mila was a very good girl. It was she who brought rain during the drought, saved the poor, and helped the sick. At the time, LeBlanc thought she would sleep less and even eat less, if only her father would become a little kinder to her. But then what was supposed to happen happened. She was treated unfairly and called a stupid piece of trash. They falsely accused her and said, "Did you really think we wouldn't find you even if you hid? You cheeky rat and you naughty girl." So she became a stranger to everyone in her next family. The woman who would become her mother declared that it would be better for the girl to die in a ditch somewhere so that no one would ever find her body. Other family members also looked at her disapprovingly. The owner of the house where she lived, the Duke, declared that she was nothing but a useless girl and a piece of trash. LeBlanc fell to her knees and began to pray. She begged forgiveness for something she hadn't done and pleaded for only one thing, that they wouldn't beat her. Ultimately, she was unable to beg their forgiveness, and her attempts to change the way they treated her in that cursed house were in vain. Soon the girl got up and suddenly saw that she was in her bed. Thank God it was just a dream. She thought she'd simply passed out. After this, LeBlanc began to cry bitterly, burying her face in the blanket. She didn't know what to do. The Dublon family's staff had been so kind to her, and she couldn't repay them. The girl's entire face was covered in tears. Duke Dublon turned out to be a truly kind-hearted man. But what if he and his servants one day came to hate her? After that, LeBlanc looked out the window. Outside was a clear moonlit night. And suddenly, she thought she heard a rumble somewhere. Was that thunder? After a while, it really did start raining outside. The raindrops could be heard hitting the palace roof. Lydia, who was watching the girl, looked at her with pitiful eyes and sighed heavily. There were other maids around her too. Everyone was curious to know if the baby was okay. Someone said the doctor had assured her there were no problems. Lily added that the girl is now simply sleeping after taking fever-reducing medication. Then someone came up and asked, "Where is the baby now?" Lydia looked at the bed with concern and suddenly noticed that there was no one there. Candles were immediately lit in the room and throughout the house to find the baby as quickly as possible. But, unfortunately, she was nowhere to be found. After some time, the butler ran into the Duke's chambers and announced that His Grace needed to know immediately that the child was missing. Duke Dublon's face darkened. He looked at the butler with displeasure and asked how such a thing could have been allowed to happen. After a while, everyone in the house joined in the search for the girl. People wandered through the hallways and rooms, trying to find the young lady. The poor girls were in complete despair. They searched for their little mistress, but, unfortunately, they couldn't find her anywhere. The butler ran up to the Duke, who was standing in the foyer, and reported that the girl had not been found in the south wing. Duke Dublon ordered the search to continue until the baby was found. "Check the kitchen. She may have gone there looking for bread." The butler replied that they had already checked the kitchen and she was not there. The Duke thought for a moment. Could this really be the work of assassins who might have been sent to his mansion? That would be very bad. Or perhaps someone had kidnapped the girl for ransom. The servants were terrified. Perhaps the child really is some kind of secret spy, and not a child of fate at all. But soon, Lily and the other girls heard the news. The girl had been found after all. Duke Dublon looked hopefully in the direction from which the voice came, announcing that the child had been found. When everyone went outside, they saw a little girl surrounded by servants and maids. LeBlanc stood in the rain, hunched over and shivering slightly. Lily rushed to her side and anxiously asked the young lady how she was feeling. The girl stood before her, her hands trembling, clasped together. They shook from the cold, and she remained silent. After some time, the Duke approached them. Looking attentively at the girl surrounded by people, LeBlanc's entire body was wet. She was shaking and unable to speak, but the next moment she ran up to the Duke, standing next to her, and held out something to him in her palms. LeBlanc held a small red carnation in her hands. Her body trembled. The girl quietly said, "Here's a carnation." After this, in a trembling voice, she added that she had done wrong and asked the Duke for forgiveness. Then she repeated again, "Please, forgive me." She suddenly remembered the Duke's face during their last meeting in the office, when he told her that she had enough of interfering and should return to her room. The girl apologized again and added that she didn't want to ruin anything. Lily, who was watching everything from the side, covered her mouth in amazement. The scene was so touching. The Duke's assistant lowered his face, barely holding back tears. He felt very sorry for the little girl. No one said anything. Only the astonished Duke of Dublin stared at her in silence. Finally, he noticed that the girl had run out into the garden completely barefoot. Now she was standing in the rain, wet and barefoot. The poor girl continued to hold the carnation flower in her hand. The Duke looked at the child holding out a flower to him, and a strange shudder ran through him. He felt sorry for her. He couldn't help himself. He realized he had been heartless toward this little girl and had behaved differently than usual. Finally, everyone returned home. The rain had stopped, but the lights were still burning in the palace in the middle of the night. Little LeBlanc sat by the bathtub, preparing to warm her cold body. She looked at the young Duke standing before her, unsure what he intended to do with her. She wondered if one carnation hadn't been enough of an apology. The girl was terrified of what was about to happen. A ridiculous thought even crossed her mind. Would the Duke really drown her in this bathtub? But why that? Why drown her right away, she thought. However, after some time, she was very surprised. The Duke himself brought a basin of hot water to her feet and invited her to soak them in it. LeBlanc was stunned. The Duke had decided to take care of her and keep her warm himself. That was completely unlike him. Even more unexpected was what happened next. The Duke splashed some water on her heel and asked, "Isn't it too hot?" The girl was frightened at first, but then calmed down. She even felt pleased. She replied, "No, the water isn't cold." The Duke looked at his little ward questioningly and slightly perplexedly. Then the girl quietly added, "It's still a little hot. I was just afraid to say it right away." After this, the Duke took the girl's little foot in his palms and began to carefully rub it with warm water. His hands became softer and more careful. He said, "You shouldn't walk around the mansion at night." LeBlanc couldn't believe her eyes or ears. "Was this really it?" she asked cautiously. "You're not angry with me?" He didn't seem to be angry at all. The young man lightly stroked her head. After this, Duke Dublin smiled. It seemed sincerely for the first time, and said, "I'm not angry at all." LeBlanc was overjoyed. It seemed her idea had worked. She had managed to get a little closer to this man. After that, her life changed noticeably. She no longer felt so afraid around the Duke, and life in the palace gradually began to return to normal. And yet, for several days, she felt as if she were walking on thin ice every time she left her room and went into the hallway. The Duke never scolded her or even expressed displeasure. Yet every time she left the room, she checked to see if he was anywhere nearby. One day, she secretly looked into the Duke's room through the half-open door and saw that the carnation she had given him was standing in a vase of water. LeBlanc was overjoyed and amazed. The Duke placed her flower in a vase, so perhaps he truly treasured this gift. She also wondered why the Duke wasn't angry with her and even accepted the gift. After all, this was the same Duke Dublin who once destroyed foreign lands for a stupid reason, and now he was so kind to her. Lily and the other maids were also very kind to her. When they turned to LeBlanc, she, confused, asked, "What?" The girls immediately began talking at once. One said, "We're getting ready to meet the merchants." Another asked, "Would you like to come with us?" and added, "There will be lots of interesting things there." LeBlanc was delighted. "Oh, right! They're buying a gift for the emperor," she thought. But then another thought frightened her. What if I break something? Still, after a moment's consideration, she agreed to go with them. The maids immediately burst into loud laughter. They said they needed to wait a little longer for the merchants to arrive, and one of them suggested going to the library. Leblon spread her arms wide and agreed to go to the library. She was glad for any opportunity to spend time with her beloved girls. When she entered the library, she was literally stunned by the huge number of books collected in the Duke's storage. One of the maids came up to her and said, "Let's choose something for you to read." Another girl ran up to her and said that she could learn useful skills in advance, and showed her a book called 101 Ways to Scam. Then another girl came running and declared that a good book was the key to the future. She was holding a book called Conquer Them, Wandering Warrior. Another of the girls suggested that she read the book, How to Break Up in 5 Minutes. The girls started arguing among themselves, saying they were each trying to force her to read some kind of horror story. They argued loudly, and one of them even declared that fraud was a very useful topic. Leblon decided she should pretend to the maids that she couldn't read. Then maybe they'd calm down. She decided to choose something with a nice cover. After that, she began to look at the books in the bookcases. One of them caught her eye. What was strange was that it had no title. She looked closely at the book, which looked rather strange. She couldn't understand why Dublon was keeping such a book, which seemed so ordinary. After this, the girl opened the book and looked between its pages. Inside, it recounted Emperor Fida's greatest achievements, defeating the demon god Ivan. The book stated that, according to records, awakening the evil god is quite difficult, but this is possible if you possess a certain relic, and it is with its help that you can make a contract with the evil god. And then it is necessary to obtain a catalyst that should ensure the safety of the bearer of power, so that evil can take advantage of this connection. Leblon read all this in a strange book. She was both surprised and a little frightened by what she learned. After that, she closed the book, deciding that she had had enough of this strange reading. She considered what she'd just read. A divine contract. But how to harness such power? And it all seemed a little repulsive to her. She couldn't understand why everything in this book was linked to an evil god. The chief god and ruler of this world was named Nerid. He ruled over the other gods and was considered the supreme ruler of the heavens. For the sake of the world's inhabitants, for the sake of humanity, the god Nerida sealed away the evil god who was the source of evil. He bound him in heavy chains, but things weren't so simple. Over the years, the seal gradually weakened, and this was inevitable. To reseal the evil god, the power of a girl named Mila was required. This is precisely what she was destined to do in the future. But on the other hand, in a past life, Leblon herself had been a victim of this ritual. The ritual was so painful that she wanted only one thing: to be killed. She still hasn't forgotten the suffering she experienced at that moment, and never wanted it to happen again. At this time, her thoughts were interrupted by one of the maids, who turned to the young lady. The girl immediately spoke to her, calling her "Little Sister Junie." Afterwards, the other maids ran up to her and began looking at her with affection. They spoke to her and thanked her for calling them sisters. One of the girls even said, "The evil lion roared, and you cried out, 'Oh, how strange it is, sister.'" Leblon looked at them and thought she wasn't the least bit afraid. But the maids didn't need to know that. After this, Lily entered the library and called the young lady to her. The girl turned happily and asked, "Is the merchant already here?" When Lily asked if she wanted to go and see, Leblon immediately threw up her hands and shouted, "Of course!" Duke Dublon sat in a chair in his throne room. One of his guards stood next to him. Everyone waited for the merchants to appear. The girl decided it would be worthwhile to watch the performance at the Dublon mansion. Behind the Duke, something large hung on the wall. She decided it must be a tapestry belonging to the founder of the imperial court. Indeed, it was inscribed with words in an ancient language, just like she had once heard. This tapestry was famous for having been acquired by the Duke of Dublon after the conquest of foreign lands. The Duke had personally won this trophy in battle, and now it rightfully belonged to his family. It was even said that the emperor was eager to get his hands on this tapestry, but he was never able to buy it from Dublon. And now this tapestry hung on the wall in the Duke's throne room. It bore the symbol of the military might and authority of the head of the Dublon family. It was beneath this that the head of the family sat. He was now dressed in festive ceremonial attire. Leblon thought that the nobles who admired this tapestry also tried to steal it. They said that many people were looking at this decoration, wanting to get their hands on it. There were people who could look at him for hours without moving away or taking their eyes off him. The girl knew that most of the nobles did not even understand that they were going to their deaths. At this moment, someone's footsteps were heard, and then the man who entered said, "Greetings to the Duke of Dublon." The girl looked up and saw a strangely dressed man standing before her. It was a merchant named Turba, but suddenly she felt as if she already knew this man. Leblon kept her eyes on him, wondering why he was here. It was very strange, and she even felt a little scared. The man took his hat off his head, bowed, and said to the Duke, "It is a great honor for me to meet you." The Duke continued to sit in his chair. Turba was a self-made man. An assistant standing next to the Duke said, "We need to find a worthy gift for the nobility." Turba replied, "Then you've come to the right person. After all, I'm the only one in the world who deals in rare and useful items." Initially, he traded slaves from devastated countries, and later became a sought-after merchant among the nobility. Leblon knew this man was a simple con man who had once sold the imperial family a counterfeit. She had to do something. Leblon began to think about what had transpired after that incident. It wasn't the first time. There had been a huge uproar. Somehow, Duke Dublon needed to be warned. Noticing the confusion on the girl's face, Lily leaned over and asked, "Are you okay?" The girl continued to ponder. She decided that perhaps Turba had come here specifically to fool Duke Dublon. She didn't want that at all. After this, the merchant opened the chest and said, "In that case, I can recommend this." Someone present asked, "What is this?" Another man said, "This thing has inscriptions in an ancient language." The merchant immediately explained, "It's a stone tablet with a prophecy from ancient times." After this, the men present in the hall began to mutter among themselves. One said, "Isn't an oracle considered a sacred object?" Another replied, "A god's relic is certainly better than just a divine artifact containing the god's words." The assistant immediately turned to the Duke and said, "This will be a wonderful gift for the Emperor's birthday." Duke Dublon thought for a moment and asked, "Are you sure this tablet is related to the oracle?" Turba immediately spoke up. "A similar object is recorded in history books. Furthermore, we have received confirmation that this object is divine." One of the men said, "Well, if it's confirmed, then that's just great." His interlocutor added, "We should trust the Turba trader." After this, the merchant spoke again. He said, "I found this item in the old ruins." He continued, "I was attacked by monsters, but I didn't give up until I got this thing." He began to speak loudly. "I knew that the day would come when it would definitely be useful, so I couldn't abandon such an important find. It took a lot of effort to pull it out." While the others listened attentively to his words, Duke Dublon, resting his head on his hand, said, "Enough. Name the price already." Turba said, "If your mercy so desires, I am ready to sell it for 100 million francs." Everyone immediately became worried, because 100 lemons was a very large sum that could even shake the budget of the Duke of Dublon. Everyone started grumbling. Someone said, "That's right, money doesn't grow on trees. Even for the Duke of Dublon, that's quite a large sum." The girl couldn't believe her ears. When someone said, "Only this can replace Newt," she realized she couldn't let that happen. And while others were pondering this, she was thinking about what to do. The merchant seemed quite pleased with himself. He waited and hoped to be paid the agreed-upon sum. And finally, the girl made up her mind. She screamed loudly and said, "Leblon wants to see this." The merchant turned his gaze towards the girl with distrust and thought warily. After that, he smiled slightly and said, "Child of Destiny, it is a great honor for me to meet you. Of course, go and see him." One of the men present said, "Wait a minute, what if she breaks it?" Leblon ignored these words and calmly walked towards the object. After that, she knelt down in front of the open chest and said, "Wow, you fluff." One of the men asked, "Do you feel divine power?" To which the other immediately replied, "Stop it! What if a child breaks it?" The merchant Turba said, "Since this girl is a child of destiny, perhaps she can read the ancient language." One of the men asked, "How can she know an ancient language if she can't read?" To which the merchant replied, "That's just a joke. How can anyone know a language that's been lost for centuries?" But still, to the surprise of everyone present, the girl suddenly said, "Nota, who worked hard for his family, will experience thunderstorms. All the men's mouths literally dropped open in surprise. Had the girl really just managed to read the inscription? The merchant exclaimed in amazement. But how? It seemed he was not only surprised, but also a little scared. A girl named LeBlanc looked at the merchant and asked, "Uncle, who are we talking about here?" At that moment, she finally realized he was a fraud. LeBlanc decided the plaque had nothing to do with God. It was an ordinary tombstone. The other men were also interested. While the girl was thinking it was a good thing she'd checked everything herself, they asked, "How did you know what the sign said?" Even high-ranking priests struggled to master this ancient language with its strange alphabet. This was due to the difficulty of deciphering the vast number of texts, but thanks to knowledge from the future, the girl knew that in 10 years, everything would change. Many would learn to read when someone appeared who could fluently read the ancient language. Of course, even 10 years later, the speed of translation wouldn't increase much. This was probably due to the complexity of the language itself, which was very different from the traditional written language. The girl remembered that before her death, only 3 people spoke this language, and she was one of them. Another was the future heir, Prince Adrian Lurk. This language was also known to the eldest son of Duke Dublon. And of course, the third person was herself, a girl named LeBlanc. LeBlanc thought, firstly, that the merchant's claim to have discovered this item at an old excavation site was a lie. She was absolutely certain of it. It looked much more like a tombstone, where the relatives of the deceased once cried. The tombstone was located in a completely different direction from the old excavation site, and he couldn't find it there. Most likely, he simply took it from the cemetery. The men immediately surrounded the girl and began asking, "Are you saying that this is what is written there? Do you really know the ancient language? Are you saying that this is not an oracle stone, but a tombstone?" The girl smiled slightly at them in response, and quietly said, "Yes." The Duke's assistant standing nearby exclaimed, "This is simply unbelievable! Can this really be true?" Then the girl said, "I can read something else if they give it to me." One of the men asked, "Where did you learn to read?" The girl knew she had a prepared answer. She calmly replied, "I just know how." Another of the men said, "How cute it looks, and besides, of course, why lie to a 4-year-old? For the girl, this was a real salvation. She thanked the girl from the future, Mila, for this answer. Once, when asked how she read it, Mila answered, "I just know how." Mila, smiling, said, "I don't know how, but I can." It was after this that the priest said that she was truly a holy child. As expected, she was born with divine powers. LeBlanc recalled that when she learned about this, she thought that she was a true child of the oracle. And for now, she is in this role. The merchant looked downright furious. He shouted loudly, enraged, "It's all a lie!" After this, the man stated, "I have proof of my words, because the temple confirmed everything." He also asked everyone present, "How can you trust this child? How does she know how to read the ancient language?" LeBlanc glared at him. Did he really need more proof? He was a real fraud. The men suddenly fell silent, as if considering the merchant's words. A certain distrust appeared in them. Some people began to mentally analyze the situation, thinking that perhaps things were not so simple. After this, the merchant said, "The only one who knew how to write and read the ancient language was the founding emperor. How could a small child know such a thing?" The girl suddenly felt despondent. She thought that this really was different from what had happened to Mila. Unlike that girl, she was the opposite child of fate. But then, looking at the tapestry hanging on the wall, LeBlanc smiled and said, "Blessed is he who sees the mission." She stood up and, pointing her finger at the tapestry hanging on the wall, repeated the phrase again. She also read what was written on the tapestry below, "Fid Inishis Simon Kalad." The Duke was simply stunned by her words. He looked sharply at the girl and declared, "This is the true name of the founding emperor." One of the nobles said, "The true name? Did she just read it from the tapestry?" The assistant standing next to the Duke immediately repeated the true name of the emperor's father. That is why their state was otherwise called the Simon tribe, after the name of its founding father. These were the ones who are called the creators of the evil god. This tribe is so heavily tabulated that its name is simply forbidden to be pronounced. The emperor's true birth was dark. He came from a cursed tribe. Therefore, there are very few people in the state who know the true name of the founding emperor, since it is associated with a dark past. Perhaps only the imperial family and higher nobility knew about this, since all written records were destroyed. The girl knew that only the imperial family and the higher nobility knew this name. The commoners remained in the dark. She smiled at the merchant and asked, "Does this mean I've read the founder's true name?" In her opinion, this was ironclad proof that she knew the ancient language. A man standing nearby said, "They should check it out." Another of the men scratched his chin and asked again, "How is this even possible?" The young man exclaimed, "This is truly a child of destiny. I thought that she could not even read, but that was a mistake." Suddenly, the enraged nobleman declared, "Turba has decided to fool us!" and pointed his finger at him. At that moment, the merchant's face changed, and, stuttering loudly, he said, "I followed the will of God." The Duke smiled slightly and said, "What a pity! You demanded proof from the child, but if you cannot give an answer, why hide behind God?" After this, the merchant finally gave in and no longer dared or had the strength to justify himself. Leblon looked at him and thought she knew the feeling. It was true fear, and he needed to get away from here as quickly as possible. But ultimately, the Duke appeared indifferent to the merchant, likely out of suspicion. He merely said, "It seems to be quite popular lately," rising from his chair. After this, Duke Dublon said, "Even the midges are trying to get to me, and it looks quite dangerous for them." After this, the young man gave orders to Norms to escort our divine prophet to God's prison. Duke Dublon said, "You should tell me more about the stone he wanted to sell." Then the young man said, "Even if we have to rip this merchant's belly open to find out the true information about the divine oracle." The Duke's assistant, Norms, nodded in agreement. At that moment, the turba merchant tried to slip away and cried out, "Wait a minute!" He fell on his knees and began to tearfully beg the Duke, "Forgive me!" But despite all this, he was punished, and Turba told everything before the torture. This is precisely what the assistant was now reporting to the Duke, saying that the merchant had committed fraud for money. The girl listened attentively and also heard that, in order to trade with the Pope, he had to acquire a certain relic, and because he had lost money, he had to commit fraud to pay for the delivery. The girl wondered, what kind of sacred relic could have compelled him to commit such a farce? She also heard something else, but she was already interested in the drawing lying on the Duke's desk. It absorbed her entire attention. She recognized this thing because she had once seen this object called Etvel. This very decoration was once on the chest of a girl named Mila. It was a sacred relic, possessing immense power. It could identify a true child of destiny. Its color changes and differs from the color of the metal. Mila's was platinum, but this drawing said it was gold. The girl fell silent in thought. Even the precious stones here were arranged according to fate. This was unlike the Etwell kept in the Pope's temple. The Duke sighed heavily and, resting his chin on his hand, said, "So, a second Atwell has appeared." Norm said, "Now I understand why the turba trader went through with this scam." He pointed to the drawing and said, "Etwell is practical proof of Nariel's divine faith." "Perhaps so. Where is Etwell now?" The young man said, "This object is now at the bottom of the sea, and that is the biggest problem." He added, "It is not in the waters of the Empire, where the Imperial Sea is and foreign territory, but in foreign territory, somewhere 10 meters from the border." After that, Norm said, "The biggest problem will be getting it, since it is not within the Empire." Sitting at the table, Duke Dublon said, "So that's why the church couldn't get hold of this item." Norms replied, "That's right. The Nariel Church is a state religion and cannot interfere in the affairs of other countries, as this could cause war." Leblon paused. "That means Turbo wanted to exchange Etvel for cash, so that's why he needed such a huge sum. That's why he committed this scam." The Duke scratched his forehead and said, "For a matter as important as Etwell, we can ensure safe delivery ourselves." Norms asked, "Would the Duke be willing to make a deal with the king of another continent?" The Duke smiled slightly and said, "Why does the Emperor need to know about such important matters? Everything can be done secretly. They will simply start a war for it." The assistant answered his master, "Yes," and then promised to prepare everything. Leblon heard this and couldn't believe her ears. "That's the solution, but in my opinion, it's better not to do it." The Duke continued to sit at the table and give instructions to the assistant standing in front of him. After this, Norm smiled at the Duke's daughter and said, "All this happened only thanks to you." Leblon looked at him in confusion and uttered only one word, What? The youth said. In the end, the Nayot was destroyed. But we learned of the existence of the second Atwell. The girl looked at him puzzledly, as if asking, Really? And then thought, Okay, the main thing for me is a good turn of events. She decided that she could grow up big and strong without causing any problems. Then she looked angrily at the Duke, and as if asking, Well, Duke, are you ready? After this, LeBlanc grabbed the sleeve of the Duke's robe with her hand and pulled him slightly towards herself. Duke Dublon heard some movement next to him, then felt the girl's hand and, slightly squinting, looked in her direction. The girl raised her hands up and, looking into the Duke's face, said, Please be my daddy. Duke Dublon seemed unprepared for something like this. He was simply stunned by the girl's words and said nothing. LeBlanc didn't let up. She asked, Does that mean he needs a reason for this? The girl was close to tears. She could grow up big and strong on her own, without causing any trouble, but she still didn't want to be alone. The Duke's assistant looked at her and suddenly felt very sorry for this crying child. The Duke felt similar feelings. He looked at the girl, and something stirred in his chest. His eyes suddenly felt warm and sparkling. LeBlanc looked at the Duke and seemed to be pleading with her eyes. Please, Duke, be my daddy. Then she said out loud, Please be my daddy. After this, Duke Dublon took the girl under the armpits and pulled her towards him. He sat the girl on his lap, and she looked at his face with tears in her eyes in gratitude. After this, Duke Dublon spoke, and the first question that came out of his mouth was, Does this mean that the girl is ready to succeed? Crying with joy, her cheeks flushed, LeBlanc closed her eyes slightly and mumbled, Uh-huh. She was glad the man hadn't said he was ready to be her dad. But that question alone was enough. She smiled broadly and pressed herself against the man's chest. She was pleased that the Duke was smiling at her. At least it meant he didn't hate her. LeBlanc was in her room, playing, sitting near the fireplace, in which a fire was now blazing. She looked at her foot and couldn't stop rejoicing, because now she had a sock on her foot, but she was still a little dissatisfied with herself. Of course, that was another plus in her piggy bank of successes, since she already had the socks on. Lily, who was also present, praised the young lady, saying that she was smart and such a good child. The other maids also began to praise her. One said she'd only demonstrated it a few times, but the girl had quickly mastered putting on socks. Another said it was simply wonderful work, and after all, their lady was a true genius. The girl was still angry. She loudly declared that she needed to show the Duke some maturity, and that socks alone probably wouldn't be enough. The maids were very surprised when they heard this. The girl also added that the moment had come, and she was going to go to the Duke and show him everything. One of the maids said that the lady needed support, and they were ready to go with her and support her. Lily smiled and added, In that case, we'll all go together and show everything to the owner now. At this time, Duke Dublon, as usual, was in his office and working on documents. He was scribbling something on a piece of paper, and then began to sign the document when the assistant loudly informed him that a young lady had arrived. The Duke immediately stopped and looked towards the front door, waiting for his adopted daughter to appear. Immediately after, LeBlanc burst through the door carrying socks. She shouted loudly, Duke, I've learned how to put on socks. Even though her feet were bare, Duke Dublon smiled at the girl and said, Come on, show me what you can do. Sitting down on the floor, LeBlanc thought that the Duke no longer hated her as he used to, and although he was very offended by her last time, if she could do everything herself, then the chance of adoption would also increase. The girl sat down on the floor with the thought of proving to him that she was not one of those children who needed attention. She could do everything herself, and now she would show him how to put on socks. She picked up the sock, held it up in her hand, and prepared to show it off. She decided it would be a so-called interview. The maids came with her, clasping their fists for her and encouraging her, saying, You can do it, come on, lady, and so on. The girl decided that she was now a real professor of putting on socks, and therefore could teach this secret technique. With this thought in mind, she began. First, you need to grab the edge of the socks and widen the opening with the fingers of both hands. You should also carefully extend your leg forward and bend your toes. Then, with great effort, you need to begin pulling the sock onto your foot. But it's not that simple. Suddenly, something went wrong for the girl. The unruly sock suddenly slipped out of her hands and hung limply on her foot. The Duke's vassals who were present were simply touched. They thought it was very cute and encouraged the girl, saying that it was okay if it didn't work out, because she put on her socks so cutely. The girl continued putting on her sock. She needed to get a running start, or else it wouldn't work. It was as if the sock was mocking her, refusing to fit. LeBlanc tried her best, fell on her back, swayed. But the sock, as luck would have it, didn't want to fit on her. The men present even turned away so as not to embarrass the little girl. They didn't want her to pay attention to them. LeBlanc suddenly realized she'd failed miserably. She'd so wanted to show off her skills, but it hadn't been that simple, and now she was close to tears. Lily started to encourage her and said that she had been doing well recently, so there was no need to worry. The Duke also decided to encourage her, saying that while he lived here, he couldn't ignore her lack of success, but he still hoped the girl would succeed. She knew that the Duke of Dublon was extremely strict even with his own sons. The second son and the youngest are already attending the academy for outstanding students. The second son was considered especially talented and was completely immersed in the study of various sciences. And the Duke's eldest son successfully studied at an academy abroad. The Duke had sent his children to school at such a young age and was now encouraging the girl, saying that she should practice and that she would definitely succeed someday. LeBlanc was delighted and declared that she would be a good girl. She was confident that she would succeed, and so she smiled broadly at the Duke. The maids were pleased with how everything ended and looked at the young lady with joy. Lily was also very happy with how everything ended. One of the courtiers said, "God, how I envy you." Another immediately supported him. When one of the men asked, "Little one, how do you like the Duke?" The girl wanted to answer that she liked him very much, and perhaps he would be the one to adopt her. After that, everyone started laughing loudly. And when one of the men asked the Duke how great that was, he replied, "No." It all ended in a rather incomprehensible way. But LeBlanc was pleased with it all, and after the Duke stood up, she handed him her sock. So the next day, the Duke went out to patrol his territory, and the girl remained in the palace. Now she walked down the corridor, thinking about what the Duke had said he would return in about 20 days. She thought about it and decided that while the Duke was not at home, she could practice her success with socks. Suddenly, the girl stopped unexpectedly and shuddered in fright. She wondered who was making so much noise. She saw two people talking, one of whom said, "How dare a subordinate of the church set foot on the mansion's territory without the Duke's permission?" The second replied that they had come to the Duke to take the child away from here. It was a church official, a priest, who added that the Pope was currently the girl's guardian. He continued and explained that the guardian did not need permission to remove the child, that by law he already belonged to him. LeBlanc froze in surprise. There were no other children in the palace, so she was certain they were talking about her, and that she was the one who was supposed to be taken to the temple. The girl's hand shook with fear. She didn't understand why they were taking her away. She was already imagining what would happen to her if she were taken to the temple. Only humiliation and punishment awaited her there. She imagined the face of the strict teacher from her past life, and she became very scared. All this was completely inopportune. She felt like she was in paradise in this house, and now everything could change so quickly for the worse. Was she really going to be sent to the Duke's house in Valon? She really didn't want that to happen. She wanted to stay in the Duchy of Dublon. And although the Duke's history was short, it was still wonderful here. Duke Dublon was a very good man, although few knew it. The Duke's family had a relatively short history, but the reason his family rose so quickly was well known. It was all thanks to their unique teaching methods. Born from the blood of their kin, they quickly gained strength and were known for their warlike nature. They were raised as soldiers, and Duke Dublon was one of them. His name was Theodore Dublon, and he was the true ruler, close to the ideal version of Dublon. Duke Dublon was a true military force, unrivaled in his own right. He was a killing machine and could fight indefinitely. Everything was perfect for this. His physique was perfect and muscular, so he always succeeded in areas where physical strength was required. Just a few years after assuming the post following the death of the previous duke, he achieved unprecedented success. During this time, the Dublon family treasury doubled several times over. But beyond that, he also gained unlimited power and was so powerful that he feared nothing and no one. He always had a cold, indifferent gaze and was the very ideal version of Dublon he had strived for. The following events took place in the regional inspectorate office at the time when the events described were taking place in the Duke's palace. The midday meal was just beginning when one of the men asked, "You too?" His companion replied, "I can't even eat a crumb because of all this." The employees standing nearby turned their heads warily in their direction. The trembling boy wanted to make excuses, but instead he only groaned and moaned. Another man suddenly said that he felt a magical power, and then added that carrying magical tools that are not intended for protection is prohibited by law. The boy became frightened and claimed he only needed the item for communication. He then explained that he had been asked to buy fabric for a young lady. The man looked at the boy angrily and asked, "Is a magical communication tool really needed to buy some fabric?" He then told him to give him the magical item, and he would check everything himself. The next moment, he grabbed the boy by the hand and tried to snatch from it an object glowing with all the colors of the spectrum. A struggle ensued, and during this struggle, the object began to glow even brighter and blinded both participants in the brawl. Meanwhile, in the Duke's house, everything was as usual. A little girl named LeBlanc approached the man and said, "Duke." After that, she tried to say the word again, but all she could manage was, "Getzog." She couldn't pronounce the word at all, but she added, "You're adorable." She saw all the men in the room suddenly burst into laughter. It was simply terrifying. She thought, what if the Duke hates me because I can't pronounce the word Duke correctly? One of the men said that the girl was simply a real cutie. The boy confirmed that this was indeed the case. He was the boy who had received the recording in exchange for buying the fabric. The Duke's assistant also laughed and said that it was surprising how much she liked the Duke. But the Duke didn't seem to be amused. He looked seriously at the other men and said, "There's nothing funny about this. She's just weird." One of the vassals begged his pardon and declared, "Honestly, the girl is simply adorable. As the saying goes, if she doesn't look cute, she's not human." Duke Dublin looked stern and cold upon hearing these words. It was very much in character. It might have seemed as if a real predatory tiger looked at those present in the dining room and forced them to eat in silence. After this, the Duke turned his head to the speaker and asked again, "Is she really cute?" Then he added that he did not consider the girl cute at all, although he did not understand this emotion. He remembered what this girl looked like. When she slept, she simply looked like a child, but he noticed that she was quite energetic. He also liked her smile and the way she mispronounced the word Duke. He also noticed a mole on her neck near her shoulder. The Duke thought that every time LeBlanc raised his head, tilting it forward, the mole, oddly enough, grew wider. It was all rather odd. One of the men looked at the Duke and thought, "Does the Duke not like it? Isn't he at all charmed by this little girl?" One of the men decided to change the subject to avoid further escalation. He stated that the situation around their duchy had been tense lately. The man felt like he was sweating under a waterfall. Duke Dublin looked at him and asked, "What exactly are we talking about?" Then the knight told everyone present that he had heard that recently a gang of bandits had been operating in the area, not far from the Duke's territory. Then he suddenly became cheerful and smiled, deciding that the unpleasant question had already flown into the past. Duke Dublin closed his eye and then quietly said that this was not happening on his territory at all, and therefore he did not care at all. But the knight still wouldn't let up. He said, "Fine," and then added that he only mentioned it because children had been disappearing in some regions recently. Hearing this, Duke Dublin seemed to startle and turned his head sharply with sparkling eyes. He immediately imagined some bandit who, turning to the child, says, "My darling, would you like to play hide-and-seek with me, sweetie?" The Duke also pictured his little adopted daughter, locked in a cage, saying, "I don't want to," and calling out to the Duke. Duke Dublin thought for a moment, imagining such a scene, then sighed heavily. After this, the young man spoke up and said that he could not allow these bastards from the gang to roam around his territory. The knights were amazed by the words of their master, who declared that he would sort everything out, although he did not know how long it would take. He thought about why he should deal with the bastards on someone else's territory, but he still said out loud that he would do it right up to the border of the Roxel region. The Duke thought there was a beautiful garden in the Roxel region, frequented by aristocratic ladies. He even imagined LeBlanc strolling through the garden like a lady. The man also clearly saw in front of him how some bandit grabbed LeBlanc and kidnapped this little beauty. The Duke closed his eye and said out loud that they should abandon visiting this region and that it would be necessary to restore order there. Then his thought returned, and he decided that perhaps when LeBlanc grew up, she would like to take up horse riding, and there was an excellent race course in the Roxhill area. He clearly saw her as a rider. And again, as before, the evil kidnapper kidnaps the girl, and she cannot escape from his strong clutches. The Duke said that from now on, visiting the hippodrome would also be stopped. And again, he thought about the beautiful river view on the plain. But what if the girl wanted to take a stroll there too? What should he do? In that case, if she did, the Duke considered this and decided that, in any case, given this turn of events, the girl would inevitably be kidnapped, so he ordered the destruction of everything down to the base of the Nosis River. And when he was told it was located 100 kilometers from their territory, he replied that it had to be done anyway. Thus, the knights who raised this issue destroyed the entire group of robbers, since they themselves had to take care of this matter. The midday sun was setting, but its rays still penetrated the room, illuminating the lonely plants. When Lily entered the room, she saw only the young lady's legs sticking out of some box. She immediately approached the girl, pulled her out of the box, and asked what she was doing there. LeBlanc turned her head and replied that a grandfather had given her a briefcase, and now she couldn't find it. Lily immediately found the girl's gift bag and said, "Here it is!" After which she asked why she needed it. The girl replied that she simply decided to look for her. She was angry with herself for having to lie to her close friend, but she had no choice, and so she mentally asked for forgiveness for it. She couldn't tell anything because it was a deathly secret. Lily was puzzled by the young lady's behavior. She was acting strangely because immediately afterward, the girl with the school bag ran off somewhere. On the way, she thought that this was a matter she had to do herself. If the priests took her, they'd send her to the Villan house. She wouldn't be able to escape, so she had to prepare and act. Now, with her briefcase over her shoulder, she intended to carry out one of the points of her plan. She ran down the corridor, thinking that she should escape from here. LeBlanc ran quickly down the corridor. She thought the Duke would never have left her if he'd known the temple and the Empress were in cahoots. He was currently inspecting the grounds and wouldn't be back for 2 weeks. The girl again remembered the face of the temple teacher from her previous life. She decided that now the temple would send her back to some hated family. She didn't want that at all, because they could keep a close eye on her there, and she definitely wouldn't be able to escape from there. She would need to escape the priests on her way to the capital. That's why she was now heading for the kitchen in the Duke's palace. Upon seeing her, the girl in charge of snacks immediately asked the young lady what she was doing there. LeBlanc answered the question with a question, asking if the girl could give her some water. She spread her arms wide and said, "I need this much water." Hearing this, the girl laughed and said that it was good, and then asked again if she needed anything else. After that, she poured the girl a full container of drinking water. After this, LeBlanc turned her back to the maid so that she could see her briefcase and asked her to put water inside it. The maid laughed loudly again and said that she would definitely do so. Now LeBlanc was feeling better. She'd done something. She had water, and she'd also secretly stocked up on snacks. As she left the kitchen, she thought that she was now a little more prepared for the upcoming escape. She moved quickly along the corridor, thinking about what else she needed to do. LeBlanc opened the door slightly and thought that she would need to prepare everything properly, because when she was tired, she became like a child and needed to be nourished by something. She looked into her bag, put some candies in there, and decided that there was no such thing as too much food, and it would be nice to add some more. Looking at the briefcase, she decided that she needed to do this for her stomach's sake as well. But it seemed that everything could no longer fit inside. She was dissatisfied because the briefcase turned out to be rather small. She only put 13 candies inside. Afterwards, she remembered she'd also brought a map, clothes, and shoes. Because of this, she had to throw out several candies because there wasn't room for them in her purse. Then LeBlanc thought again. Perhaps something else would need to be done. She pulled back the curtain in the room, thinking that now the most important thing remained. There, behind the curtain, her true treasure was hidden. It was a pouch filled with coins. It would also be useful during her escape. LeBlanc pressed the coins to her cheek, calling the gold coins her precious. She hid the pocket money she received from her vassals in this pouch. Looking at the bag, she began to tie it and decided that she was now finally ready to escape. The girl didn't notice how Lily came up behind her and, turning to the young lady, asked, "What are you up to?" LeBlanc felt like her heart was about to pound out of her chest with fear. She was so frightened that she screamed loudly and then, gathering her strength, said, "I'm not planning anything. I just packed my bag. Just this one." LeBlanc covered her mouth with her hands, afraid she might blurt out something unnecessary. She didn't want to reveal her secret to anyone. Lily, standing right in front of her, looked the girl in the face and remained silent. She didn't want to pry anything out. After this, apparently understanding what the girl was up to, the maid pulled her close, hugged her, and said, "I think we'll have to say goodbye soon. This is your chance to grow up and receive parental love." She stroked LeBlanc's head and said, "Since you are a wonderful person, I am sure that someone will definitely fall in love with the young lady." At that very moment, tears streamed down the girl's face. She wanted to object to Lily because she felt like no one liked her. Then she decided she'd rather fall into the manure than go inside the temple. Looking at Lily's beautiful face, the girl thought she couldn't ask her for help because she was just a simple servant. And if she asked her for help, there was a chance she'd be killed for it. The sweet maid called the girl to follow her, saying that she had prepared some snacks for her. After that, she took the girl by the hand and led her towards the dining room. Outside, the other maids were already waiting for the girl. They had toys in their arms and loudly exclaimed, "We want to put on a show today!" One of the girls, with a trembling voice and tears in her eyes, told the young lady that she should eat and watch her favorite fairy tale. Another said that their young lady should stay, and they needed to fight for her. After this, all three girls burst into tears and began to cry loudly in chorus. They hugged each other and began to cry loudly. So sorry were they for their young lady. The girl sat down at the table with refreshments. She noticed that one of the girls had been holding some strange objects lately. She always carried them with her and took them out when the girl ate. But if you think about it, the snacks yesterday were simply wonderful. A moment later, the girl remembered how happy they had been yesterday, when they had been walking together, having fun, laughing loudly. LeBlanc thought the memories of the Dublin mansion would make her feel homesick. Even now, a tear trickled down her cheek, because compared to her past lives, this place was a true paradise. Seeing something wrong with the girl, the maids immediately inquired why the young lady was crying. Then they asked who had made their mistress shed tears, promising to catch them and scold them. Lily looked at the girl with pity in her eyes. She felt so sorry. She thought that if LeBlanc left, she would never see this sweet and kind girl again. LeBlanc burst into bitter tears, unable to change anything. If Duke Dublin had been here, he might not have allowed her to be taken. And so she cried loudly, saying, "I want to go to the Duke." The maids immediately began to hug her and calm her down, while the girl thought that she really missed such a cold-blooded person. Seeing a strange object in the hand of one of the women, she wondered what it could be, but then decided that she did not need it, because no matter how much she cried, nothing changed. Finally, the day of her departure arrived. The maids were packing her last belongings into a chest. When the priests from the temple arrived, the girl stood at the butler's foot, as if asking him for help and hoping that he could protect her. The Duke's assistant asked the new arrivals why they had arrived so suddenly. The smiling priest replied, "We can come whenever we like. After all, we are the order of the Holy Pope." The maids ran over and said they'd put some water and food in. Another said everything needed to be packed properly, clothes needed to fit the lady, and that the young lady couldn't afford to get sick. She needed to be warm and comfortable. After this, Lily approached the girl and said that she would like to say goodbye to her. One of the priests looked at the girl with a sly look, and addressing her as a respected young lady, asked, "How are you doing?" LeBlanc didn't like him at all. She looked at him fearfully and didn't answer. Then he leaned closer and said, "You must have suffered greatly in a place where there is no connection with the Holy Pope." The girl lowered her eyes to the floor and said quietly, "I didn't suffer at all." The priest laughed and said, "Now you have absolutely nothing to worry about. We've managed to find a family who will take care of you and raise you as a young lady." The girl was amazed by his words that Duke Volin would be happy to become her new father and was ready to raise her with love and care. LeBlanc immediately remembered her previous life. There was no talk of any love or care there, as he had raised her only with the whip and hunger. She remembered that in her previous life, the temple had chosen this duke for something other than her. When she'd manifested her power as a child of fate, this family had been friendly to its use, but not to her. She did not forget how they treated her, when she was chained with an iron chain like a dog and could not go anywhere, while she was very hungry and suffering. She thought this was the worst possible outcome. If she ended up with that ducal family again, she would never be able to escape, and her fate would be sealed. As soon as LeBlanc heard it was time to leave, she began shaking her head, saying, "No, no, I don't want to." She tried her best to avoid this trip. The priest pulled her by the hand, saying that they needed to leave now, but the girl resisted with both feet and only repeated, "No, no." Lily, outraged by all this, cried out loudly, "Young lady!" She really wanted to protect the girl. The priest who came to pick up the girl became completely enraged. He shouted at her that if she continued to be hysterical, God would punish her. After that, he continued and shouted, "If you have received divine power, then you are obligated to side with the temple and not oppose its commands. You should be glad that you will be adopted by the Volan family, because such a chance only comes once in a lifetime." He also said the girl should be happy that she would be adopted by them, and that she would be much better off there. Suddenly, she smelled the scent of alcohol from somewhere, and the sound of a leather belt dragging across the floor. The sound of a leather belt hitting skin. LeBlanc thought that just remembering what happened in her past life would cause her breathing to quicken. She suddenly began to gasp for air, and her body became covered in a cold sweat. The priest leaned over to the girl, who was trembling all over, took her by the chin and asked, "What's wrong with you, little one?" At that moment, everyone turned their heads sharply in the direction from which a loud voice was heard. "Get your hands off my daughter right now!" LeBlanc also looked in the direction from which the words had come. She recognized the voice well, and it could only belong to one person. The priest, still holding the girl's chin, didn't have time to remove his hand. He glanced warily toward Duke Dublon. It seemed as if something terrible was about to happen. So sharp was the young duke's voice. He said, "I believe I already told you to stay away from me and my daughter." The duke was terrifying in his anger. His face resembled that of a beast ready to kill its prey. Behind him, the faces of his knights were the same, covered in dirt and sweat from the long journey. They were just as angry as their master. The priest began to defend himself, saying it was too late to change anything, since the decision to give the young lady to the Volan family had already been made. Then the man added that in that case, they should discuss everything. He shouted that this couldn't be done after several dozen naked, sharp swords moved toward his neck. Then the master of the house, Duke Dublon, spoke up. He turned to the man and asked, "Did I really allow you to open your mouth?" The girl, held by the hands, couldn't believe her luck. Was she really going to be rescued and left in the duke's palace? The priest still held her hand, as if he were in a vice. She couldn't break free and thought it would never work. But the next moment, the duke grabbed the priest's wrist with his powerful palm, twisted it, and thus freed her hand from the strong grip. While the priest shouted loudly, the duke said, "Go and deliver a message from me. From today on, LeBlanc is part of the Dublon family and will not leave this house again." After this, the duke bent over the little girl and, grabbing her by her small body, took her in his arms. As the girl settled into the duke's arms, he continued, "In the future, if you decide to discuss the matter concerning this child, you should come here at least with a holy order." After this, the man stroked the little girl's cheek, from both of whose eyes tears were still flowing. Duke Dublon looked at the little girl in his arms and said that she did look rather ugly when she cried. The girl cried even louder, thinking, "Is it really possible to say such a thing? Is my face really that ugly when I cry?" The duke continued and said that the first thing she needed to do now was wash herself. After this, the duke looked sternly at the priest and said only one word to him, "Get lost." The priest, trembling all over, looked predatorily at the duke, but decided that for his own safety, he needed to leave here as quickly as possible. The duke's young assistant was simply proud of his master's behavior. He watched the departing priests joyfully, then added that, since the decision had been made, they could leave. Thus, the girl's life in the house continued. She once again felt like she was in true paradise, and it seemed that nothing was threatening this anymore. The nobleman who appeared inside the palace smiled broadly at her and said, "Come here, young lady, come into my arms." This was serious. Lord Terramore's eyes darkened, his face distorted with hatred, and he hissed quietly. She continued to cry, clinging to him. It seemed to her that this embrace was the only thing that could calm her down now. She was very scared, And Lily, who approached the gentleman, was right when she said that the young lady was very frightened. She doesn't usually act like this. The Duke replied to the maid that if she did not mind leaving the girl with him for a while, then so be it. Everyone was simply shocked by what they heard. Could it be that the Duke, who never showed such feelings to anyone, had decided to keep the girl in his arms? Could he really be completely serious? Leblon looked at the Duke and thought that, frankly, this was a little annoying. She decided to ask the Duke for forgiveness. The Duke then added that the girl seemed to like him very much, and if she liked being in his arms so much, then she could continue to stay here. One of the nobles and the maid could not believe that this was really their strict master, whom everyone considered a real villain, speaking. After this, the Duke looked at both of them carefully and asked if everything was correct. Lily smiled and replied that that was all right, and then said that she would leave the room. The door to the room closed, and the nobleman and the girl left. The girl thought about how Duke Dublon had recently called her his daughter. Was she really so lucky? Could his words really be true? She remembered the Duke's words to the priest. "I thought I told you to stay away from my daughter. Does this mean that now she can really become his daughter and stay here forever?" So the girl again pressed herself against the Duke's shoulder, and despite her tears, promised him, "If LeBlanc stays here, she'll behave well. I'll eat a little and become a very good girl." The Duke looked closely at LeBlanc and said, "You should stop already. You don't need to promise anything. I'm ready to adopt you no matter what." LeBlanc looked gratefully into the young man's eyes, unable to believe her good fortune. Could her dream really come true, and she'd never leave this palace again? The fire crackled in the fireplace, and looking at the Duke's face, illuminated by the flames, the girl thought he looked completely fearless, and she really liked it. Pressing herself against the young man's body, she suddenly felt something strange. It was a very strange feeling, but I could think about it later. She pressed herself against the Duke, and he said, "Now LeBlanc can get some sleep." The girl sat for a little while longer, with her eyes half open, but fatigue took its toll, and very soon she fell asleep. The next day, she immediately rushed to her friends and shouted, "I was adopted!" Her closest friend immediately rushed to meet her and said joyfully, "You were adopted!" She was very happy for the young lady. The girl decided that she would now be called LeBlanc Dublon. She was finally part of the family and rejoiced, arms spread wide. Holding the notebook in her hands, she thought she'd found herself in an incredible family. After all, the head of this house had broken the priest's arm while defending her, and he'd gotten away with it. Moreover, she learned that the emperor personally conducted negotiations with the church on behalf of the Duke. They say the Duke's money was involved too. The church must have been bribed. LeBlanc was overjoyed at what had happened. She had found herself in true paradise and thought how sweet life could be for an orphan. Lying on the lawn, she drew the number 5 on a piece of paper and thought that now she needed to grow another 5 years. By the time she was 10, she should have at least some self-control. Even if she was hungry or tired, she would have to say goodbye to childish behavior. By then, she would be able to leave this place. At that moment, she heard 2 maids talking. One said, "So the 2 young gentlemen will be back soon." The girl, who had been eavesdropping on the 2 maids' conversation, decided she should stick to her plan. She needed to be as quiet as a mouse and save up for her upcoming trip. She was confident that she would succeed. She just needed to prepare properly. After this, LeBlanc ran up to one of the maids and asked her, "Did my button come off?" She noticed that a button was missing from the girl's dress. A moment later, LeBlanc asked the girl to give her the button. She wanted to play with it. The sweet girl immediately agreed and began to hand the button to the young lady. But Lily spoke out against all this, suddenly saying loudly, "Stop! What will happen if the girl accidentally swallows it?" LeBlanc was upset. She started sniffling and was on the verge of tears. But then something strange happened. Another girl pulled the button on her cuff so hard that hers came off too. After that, she took a thread and a needle and started doing something. Lily and the little baby watched all this with surprise. Not understanding, the girl quickly and skillfully strung several buttons onto a long thread with a needle. Finally, she showed them a string with some buttons on it and said, "Now you can play with them." The girl immediately grabbed the thread with joy and began waving it. It was a real gift. After that, she was ready to start dancing. Her button idea had worked out even better than she'd expected. Now she could sell these buttons and make some money. At this point, One of the girls looked out the window with concern. It seemed real changes were awaiting them in their lives. She noticed a young man walking down the street, but it wasn't him that alarmed the girl. When the girl looked more closely, she saw an old man heading towards the entrance of the palace. It was a man with a sinister look. Could this really be Lord Terramore? The Senate also supports the Duke, but he must have come back again because of some shortcoming. Lily was also worried. She ordered the maid to close the curtains and then said to the young lady, "You shouldn't draw attention to yourself." The girl who had drawn the curtains all the way agreed with her and said, "It certainly wouldn't hurt to take such a precaution." Then she added, "We can't allow the Senate to discuss the option of expediting the young lady's education as it did with the young gentleman. Besides, that man only glares and looks with disgust." Lily decided to defuse the situation and asked the young lady, "Would you like to go to lunch?" In this palace, most meals were served in private rooms, where food was delivered. Since the Duke of Dublin was very busy, his meals were usually held in his private study. LeBlanc wondered why they decided to deviate from their usual mealtimes and why they were inviting her to the cafeteria. What was the point of inviting her to lunch today? Then she remembered the old man's face and thought that perhaps she had met him once before. She felt as if she had seen him somewhere before. The girl began to think about where this could have happened and under what circumstances. But, unfortunately, nothing came to her mind. When she arrived in the dining room, the Duke of Dublin was already sitting at the table, and two unfamiliar boys were sitting at his right hand. LeBlanc joyfully ran into the dining room, but then suddenly stopped short when she noticed the strangers. She said, "Hello," and froze in place. She thought she saw one of the boys looking at her strangely. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but she decided to be wary. The girl stood there, wondering who these strangers were. She was worried about whether they might somehow influence her stay in this house. Both boys were busy eating. One looked gloomy and sad. The other seemed more friendly and smiled slightly. The young Duke turned to the girl, called her by name, and said, "LeBlanc, come and join us." The girl paused, hesitant. She didn't know how to act in front of these boys and waited to see what would happen next. But then LeBlanc ran quickly towards Duke Dublin, trying to hide as close as possible under his arm. As soon as the girl approached the Duke's chair, he immediately grabbed her with his muscular arms, and a moment later, she was sitting on his lap. She began to examine the boys sitting at the table. One of them was the Duke's smiling second son, named Henry. The other boy was the third son, Isaac. He was more withdrawn and less open to communication, appearing wary. The girl noticed that her sons looked very much like their father. They had identical silver hair and blue eyes, but their auras were completely different. After that, LeBlanc thought about it and decided that one thing was obvious. In front of her were some kind of mini versions of Duke Dublin. Rumor has it that the girl knew the Duke's eldest son was studying abroad, so he couldn't come. Her thoughts were interrupted by the Duke, who decided to introduce the girl to his sons, naming her Libby. One of the boys said to her, "Hi, Libby, it's very nice to meet you." The other boy was still holding the fork with food on it and remained silent, as if he was hesitant to say anything. This boy's name was Isaac. He was, of course, very different from his brother. He seemed like a prickly hedgehog, ready to curl up into a ball and not communicate with anyone. Looking at him, LeBlanc thought that he was very tall for his age, which was quite unusual. She looked at her arms and legs and thought that she was growing rather slowly. She even envied him a little for that. But there was something else, even more important. This family conquered their mountain peak solely on their own, without any help. She knew that Henry, while still very young, would become the financial backbone of the empire. He was incredibly intelligent and succeeded in almost everything. Therefore, in the future, he would become the head of the family in his early 20s. She remembered hearing Duke Amiti say, "I don't like him, a sly fox who fills his belly while cleverly eluding the law." That's how Duke Amiti described Henry. The girl tried to remember what else she knew about Henry and Isaac from her past life. She knew that Isaac already possessed an outstanding talent for martial arts. He was a true fighter and in no way inferior to most adults. She knew that in the future, this boy would become one of the 4 greatest knights of their empire. Many people would obey him and respect his strength and courage. She remembered how another family had called Isaac a cruel scoundrel. That's how Duke Volan had described the boy she was now sitting at the table with. LeBlanc reflected on how unique these young men were. They would later be called the Knights of Mina, or Guardian Brothers. She remembered how both boys were devoted to the same girl they were protecting. Mina was like a little sister to them. She recalled the moment she was falsely accused of attempting to murder Mina. She'd been told then that she should thank fate for not running into the Dublon brothers, who would have killed her on the spot. When she heard that these brothers could tear her apart, she was afraid of them both from then on. The mere mention of their names sent her cowering, her heart clenching in fear. LeBlanc tried to shake off these terrible thoughts as quickly as possible and return to the present. Perhaps she could change everything, and her fate wouldn't be so dire. She clenched her fist nervously and thought that everything was fine. After all, the brothers hadn't yet become Mina Knights, and if she didn't get on their nerves, she wouldn't have to tremble like she had then. LeBlanc decided to play the role of a harmless girl. Smiling sweetly, she waved to both brothers and said, "Hello." She knew they were the owners of this house, so she needed to make a good impression. Henry immediately smiled back at the girl. He seemed to be the nicest boy she had ever known. Isaac, on the contrary, was immersed in his thoughts and did not even turn his head in her direction. However, a moment later, the girl noticed that both brothers were smiling slightly, and she thanked the heavens for it. She decided that perhaps she could get along with them after all. It was a little dark in the library because the sun was already setting. Isaac stood in the darkness, his eyes flashing with anger. Henry was there too, but his expression was completely different. The girl thought they both looked completely different in the cafeteria. As soon as Isaac entered the room, his face noticeably darkened, and Henry also looked rather cold. LeBlanc stopped in front of him and said questioningly, "Yes?" The boy looked at her with his sparkling eyes and asked, "Do you like carrots?" LeBlanc couldn't understand the purpose of this question, but she still answered affirmatively. "Uh-huh." Meanwhile, Brother Isaac sat at the table, pen in hand, deep in thought. He sighed heavily, as if he had no interest in the conversation. Isaac asked the girl even louder, "Are you a rabbit?" Apparently, this had something to do with his previous question about carrots. The girl smiled slightly, and it seemed to her, she was ready to swear it, that her brother had just quietly called Isaac an idiot. She suddenly wondered what Henry was doing now. She saw some scribbles on the parchment. He was quickly scribbling them in his hand. The girl walked up to the table, stood next to the chair, and glanced at the boy's notes, who was not paying any attention to her. She looked at them with a puzzled expression, but there was something familiar about the notes, as if she had seen something similar before. Noticing the girl, Henry turned his head in her direction and asked, "Do you want to tell me something?" LeBlanc replied, "I just came over because I was curious about what you were doing. I didn't want to disturb you." After that, Isaac, stretching slightly, said, "I bet my brother is up to some kind of money scam again." Henry replied, "It's called slush fund planning, idiot." LeBlanc was simply amazed at how smart Henry was. How could a child know anything about a slush fund? It seemed simply unbelievable. Henry began to think out loud and said, "The situation in the country and abroad is unstable. In times like these, choosing the right investments is especially important." Isaac didn't wait to hear him out, interrupted his brother, and said, "Yes, I know. I need to stock up on iron, right? I remember that." After this, Isaac continued, "In case of war, iron will become the most valuable material, because all weapons are made from it." Henry tried to object, and yawning slightly, said, "This is very superficial knowledge. You can't judge such things that way." Isaac seemed very angry at this. He stood up, spread his arms wide, and shouted loudly, "Then why am I wrong?" His brother, by contrast, remained completely calm. Henry closed his eyes slightly, as if mentally calculating something, and declared, "That's how merchants reason. During the war, the aristocrats will have to donate iron to the army. It will be a loss for the nobility." The girl was stunned by their conversation. Henry added, "In that case, it's better to buy iron, because the currency will lose its value." She thought it was simply incredible, children discussing such serious matters here. While Isaac was yelling at his brother again, she thought it was now clear why no one was surprised when she mentioned the inspection. They really were very smart. Isaac suddenly leaned toward the girl and said, "I need to tell you something." Then, in a threatening tone, he added, "If you're going to look down on me, I'll kill you." LeBlanc had to act. She spread her arms wide and said, "I won't do this. I think exactly the same way you do." For the first time, The boy smiled. His smile seemed quite sincere, and he asked again, "Really?" After that, he returned to his previous expression and said, "Don't be arrogant just because you're a child of fate. Besides, I'm much stronger than you." He proudly raised his nose and, pointing a finger at himself, declared, "I am the strongest man of my age in the empire." The girl and the boy's brother looked at him, puzzled. Finally, Henry spoke again and said, "There is no mercy in war. This is our family, and we must act according to its customs." The boy leaned over LeBlanc and continued, "The barons of Dublin don't even spare blood relatives. That's our fate. So someone like you is in even greater danger." The girl's head was spinning from all this talk. She even thought that perhaps she hadn't eaten enough and needed a quick snack, because she couldn't understand even half of what they were saying. The boy leaning over her said, "I hope your ambitions don't lead to your premature death." LeBlanc looked at him puzzled, unsure what this could mean. But she had to act. She had to say something, because she was a well-mannered and intelligent girl. That's why LeBlanc decided there was no point in inventing anything, and smiling broadly, shouted loudly, "Yes!" Henry seemed taken aback by her answer. He looked at the girl in confusion and abruptly fell silent. The second brother was equally astonished by her answer. Isaac froze in bewilderment. The girl thought it was a threat. Henry thought almost the same thing, that it sounded like a threat. But neither of them voiced their thoughts. After a while, Isaac was the first to come to his senses. The boy leaned his elbows on the table and laughed loudly. LeBlanc also smiled slightly, and, while her brothers were trying to figure out what was wrong with her, she hoped that everything had happened for the best, and that she had managed to establish at least some kind of contact with them. After this, one of the maids came and said to the girl, "Young lady, you need to come with me." LeBlanc smiled cheerfully and walked alongside the maid. Henry looked after the girl with bewilderment as she walked away and said, "What's wrong with her?" His eyes expressed concern and confusion. He couldn't tell if the girl was feigning innocence or if she truly was. He remembered that his older brother was a genius and learned to read at the age of 3, so this doesn't mean anything. He thought about his other brother, who seemed to live a carefree life and had no worries. Compared to him, he seemed like a complete fool, because even such people have their own plans and thoughts. He remembered the boys he'd met at the academy. They looked like cornered animals, but that was because the elite academy was simply teeming with snakes. He again recalled the face of that carefree girl. In his imagination, she was completely at odds with reality. It seemed the man who kept the family informed of the Duke and the temple's affairs wasn't so simple after all. Thoughts raced through Henry's head. He wondered why this child had appeared in this house. He also remembered that the girl was considered a child of destiny. He heard people say, "You can't even imagine how sophisticated this girl is at manipulating people with her charms." He heard something else from the same person. LeBlanc sits on the Duke's lap as if it were her rightful throne. But what will happen when the Duke actually adopts her? Henry listened to all this and couldn't help but feel uneasy. The man also told him, in that case, the young master's position will be in jeopardy. He decided he had to keep a close eye on this girl. Then his attention turned to Isaac. He asked his brother, "What are you doing?" In response, Isaac gritted his teeth and said, "That girl is not cute at all." And when his brother remarked, "It seems you're already head over heels in love with her," Isaac snapped, "Nothing of the sort." Isaac thought for a moment and wondered if he really did find this girl charming in any way. But he quickly pushed the thought away. The boy suddenly remembered LeBlanc's face and her large, bright, expressive eyes. He decided he'd just like to touch her plump cheeks just once. He remembered the way she'd looked up at him. He even wanted to scream, but there was a lump in his throat. It seemed to him that the girl, looking at him, already knew everything. After that, Isaac wondered, did his brother really think he'd fallen in love with a girl like an adult? No, that wasn't true at all. And he was going to bully her. In the hallway, the girl accidentally bumped into one of the brothers. They stopped and stared at each other for a few seconds. Isaac stared at the girl, arms folded across his chest. His entire demeanor betrayed a distinct hostility toward the palace's uninvited guest. LeBlanc looked at him in confusion. She wondered what had happened to this boy and why he was looking at her like that. She decided the situation was rather awkward and needed to say something. So she held out her bag of money and asked, "Would you like me to share some with you?" Isaac was hostile toward her. He leaned toward the girl and said, "I don't want anything from you." Then he added, "And don't try to take a position you're not qualified for." After this, the boy began to slowly approach her, as if he was going to threaten her, and said, "Otherwise." Soon, Brother Isaac appeared in the hallway. Henry looked at what was happening before his eyes and wondered what his brother was doing. Henry wondered if he was seriously considering this. It was sheer stupidity, in his opinion. LeBlanc stood with her bag in her hand and looked at the boy. She didn't understand why he was so hostile towards her, since she only wanted to befriend him and had no intention of harming him. When she looked into the boy's eyes, she noticed a hostile glint in them. Just think, threatening him with metal. That was already a defeat. The moment the boy grabbed her hand, she cried out, "I'm scared!" But the next moment, Isaac's expression changed inexplicably. He pulled out a loaf of bread from somewhere and, smiling, said, "Now I'm going to demonstratively eat this bread in front of you and not give you a single bite." For the little girl, this was pure horror. She opened her mouth wide and looked at her interlocutor with terrified eyes. All this happened before the eyes of the astonished Henry, who could not understand what was happening, and therefore thought that they were both crazy. After this, the girl decided that Isaac was incredibly cruel. She closed her eyes and said, "How dare you eat bread alone?" The girl thought that if her stomach rumbled now at the sight of Isaac eating a bun, something unimaginable would happen, because her childish thinking would definitely take over, and she would immediately grab him by the hair. She also foresaw that in that case, the Duke's decision would be unequivocal. He would definitely throw her out of here, and she would have to go somewhere far from this paradise on earth. The girl looked at the bread in the boy's hands, and she really wanted to tell him that she was not trying to take his place. She was just enjoying her life. Isaac looked into her eyes with amusement, seeing that his prank had succeeded. When he heard the girl say she didn't want to be a threat to him, he said, "That's the right thing to do." Looking at the little girl at his feet, the boy said, "You are a very good girl, and you should continue to behave like one." But LeBlanc couldn't calm down. She tugged at Isaac's sleeve and quietly said, "Bread." Isaac looked at her in confusion, but then said, "Okay." He closed his eyes slightly, and with an unimaginable expression on his face, he said, "Nothing bad will happen if we split this bun in half," and handed her half of the bun. She literally felt like a bird soaring through the sky. The bread was also sweet. It was a heavenly delight and tasted superb. So delicious that her legs just wanted to dance. The girl sat down on the floor and began chewing the bun Isaac offered her. He couldn't understand how she could eat plain bread with such gusto. After that, it was Isaac's turn to eat. As he chewed his roll, he decided he'd never have guessed the girl loved bread so much. After all, he'd simply grabbed the first thing he came across. After some time, Lily appeared next to them, who, looking at her young pet, exclaimed, "Oh my God, young lady!" After that, the maid said with a smile, "Rhea forbade you to eat baked goods and gave you strawberries instead of cake because you need to eat fruits." The next moment, the girl cried out loudly, "I didn't take this bun! Isaac gave it to me!" The boy decided that he had done wrong and was guilty of what he had done, but he was still forced to admit it, and, with a reddened face, said, "It's true." Lily leaned over them and said, "I understand everything, but since you divided the bread equally with the young master, I'm willing to turn a blind eye to it." Climbing into the girl's arms, LeBlanc thought that this time she had gotten away with it and would not be punished. When LeBlanc was already in the girl's arms, she said to Isaac, "The young lady and I must go. The baby needs some rest." As they were about to leave, LeBlanc stuck her head out and waved goodbye to the boy. "Bye-bye." Isaac looked after them with bewilderment and confusion. The boy thought about it and decided that she was not cute at all. Not at all. And how could he like someone like her? The girl was in her room, where everything was so familiar to her. As Lily sat her down on the edge of the bed, she said, "I heard you looked happy during lunch. That's just great." Afterwards, smiling broadly, the girl said, "I'm sure the young gentleman will like the young lady. This will happen, if only because you are simply charming." LeBlanc looked at the girl and wanted to argue. She was even ready to cry, because she believed Henry and Isaac simply hated her. In LeBlanc's opinion, Henry and Isaac didn't love her at all, but she wasn't about to sit idle either. She needed to somehow survive here for a few years before escaping, until she turned 10. She decided to take action. Remembering the boy's face, she thought that if they saw each other more often, the negative feelings might disappear. Remembering Isaac's face, she decided that this would not be easy at all, since he was very belligerent and hostile. But LeBlanc wasn't so simple herself. She decided that if she put her mind to it, she could achieve anything. And now her main goal was to get closer to both boys. She decided she needed to show off her best side. That's why the next morning, she rushed headlong to meet the boys again. The girl ran to the door and poked her head in. She knew that Henry and Isaac were planning to come, apparently, for dinner tonight. LeBlanc knew they were incredibly popular, which meant they were always busy and had almost no free time. They couldn't even spare a minute. LeBlanc sat down and continued to reflect. After some time, she heard footsteps in the corridor, and looking out from behind the steps, saw a boy carrying a book in front of him. She also saw the boys running after each other, and one of them punched the other in the back. It looked rather unusual and strange. After this, the older boys surrounded the younger boy and seemed to start making fun of him. LeBlanc remembered this and suddenly felt a sense of elation. She saw the face of the boy holding a heavy stick, which served as his sword. Other older boys surrounded him, and he, waving the stick, tried to drive them away. The girl immediately ran after him, but it turned out to be just a joke, because everyone suddenly stopped and started chatting with each other as if nothing had happened. LeBlanc thought she couldn't miss her chance today. She needed to seize the moment and mend fences with at least one of her brothers. She decided to act like a true spy. After dinner, she was going to ask them to play with her, and began to keep an eye on both boys. But no matter how hard she tried, they were nowhere to be found. It seemed her idea was not destined to come true. At the same time, the Duke of Dublin was in the dining room, busy with his meal. His faithful assistant stood beside him. Henry and Isaac were also sitting at the table. It wasn't exactly tense, but there wasn't much merriment at the table either. Suddenly, the Duke's assistant spoke up. A young man named Worm said, "What a meeting!" A girl appeared in the doorway. Although the atmosphere was rather awkward, she didn't know what to say, so she hesitated slightly. The girl was helped by an assistant who, smiling, said, "Young lady, you must have come because you have already missed his lordship." LeBlanc hesitated slightly, her face looking puzzled, as that wasn't entirely true. Duke Dublin looked kindly at his adopted daughter and asked her to come to him. LeBlanc smiled broadly at him and walked quickly towards the Duke, saying, "Okay." After this, she settled comfortably on the Duke's lap and noticed that there was some kind of paper scroll lying on a plate in front of him. The knights at the Duke's court were simply stunned. They almost cried out in amazement. One of the young men said, "It seems that the rumors turned out to be true, and there is a reason for all this." Another, sitting on a chair, laughingly declared, "The young lady has taken the place of honor on his lordship's lap from the very beginning." The interlocutors could not believe it and were simply amazed by his words. The man sitting next to her said, "The little one is truly a kind and gentle child. The Duke seems to adore her. Besides, she's not at all picky about food." Afterwards, the man also said, "It's quite surprising that the young lady eats bell peppers and carrots with such pleasure." Everyone knew that Duke Dublin simply hated carrots. After this, the man sitting in the chair threw his head back and said, "Please allow me to tell you all the good things about this girl. I would like to praise her to the fullest." He began to tell his story and said, "The girl is very friendly and always says hello when she meets you." Everyone was sitting at the table, and the boys were especially depressed because they were supposed to be the center of everyone's attention today. But unfortunately for them, and for LeBlanc as well, the situation took a completely different turn. Everyone was talking about it. Finally, something else happened during dinner. A stranger walked through the door and apologized for being late. The girl felt sad when she saw the man enter. It was the same old man she had recently seen in the yard, but she couldn't remember where she had seen him before. The old man looked ominous. His gaze was piercing, and his facial expression was wary and hostile. LeBlanc looked at him carefully and realized that this was exactly the man she had seen last time and whom the other inhabitants of the palace feared. She noticed that the old man had sat down next to the Duke. Did that mean he belonged to the ranks of influential vassals? LeBlanc tried again to remember where she might have seen him. It seemed her memory was beginning to return. Perhaps it was that same incident when she saw the girl passing in the dark. Then she overheard a conversation. Someone said, "Even if he's a witness, the master must cover him with his own hands." Two people were talking, and the one standing behind said, "He brought trouble on himself." Then he continued, "Didn't he himself bully the child behind his parents' back?" Now it's clear why the bully wanted revenge on him. It was then that she saw this man, hidden under the dark hood of a wide black cloak. Someone then said, "The thirst for revenge is one of the most just, but at the same time, one of the most pernicious emotions." They were talking about the offender. LeBlanc paused and remembered that this man, Lord Terramore, had no children of his own. She had, after all, overheard the maid's conversation. She couldn't understand who this old man could be mocking. She looked at the boys sitting at the table and thought that the only children within Terramore's reach were Henry and Isaac. But this seemed unlikely, as Duke Dublin's family was powerful enough to keep Terramore at arm's length. The whole thing seemed implausible. The girl tried to strain her memory, but each time she came to the same conclusion, repeating to herself, "This can't be." LeBlanc wondered if, despite all the man's strangeness, he would have dared to mock the Duke's son. But she still came to the only logical conclusion. Perhaps he would only have done so if he had completely lost his mind. She recalled a phrase from her past life. "What? Are you really saying that the Count's daughter was beaten by a teacher?" Her interlocutor then replied, "That's what everyone says. Rumors don't just happen. I think it looks absolutely terrible." The girl then said, "Incidents like this are not uncommon here." She then went on to say that similar incidents had happened in her life as well. Children were often abused by the staff. Kindergarten teachers would even hit a child in front of others. She couldn't be sure Lord Terramore was in good order. But if there had indeed been violence on his part, who was the victim? The Duke of Amity's butler assumed it was the same person. Looking at the boy sitting across from her, LeBlanc decided Henry was smart enough not to let someone like that get close. At that moment, he was saying he'd learned a lot and planned to explore a different field of study next time. After that, her gaze shifted to Isaac. Isaac seemed to have a fiery temper, which seemed rather odd. Could it be because he'd been humiliated as a child? At this time, the Duke's assistant leaned over and asked, "Did you like the food?" The girl replied, "I like everything very much." He asked this because she wasn't particularly keen on food, and this seemed rather odd to those around her. LeBlanc thought perhaps her conclusions had been a bit hasty. She would need to think it over and verify it thoroughly, but for now she simply ran away from the Duke's assistant, who was chasing after her. She urged the young man on with the words, "Faster, faster!" And he replied, "I'm already running fast." Finally, they arrived where she'd been planning to go. It was the Dublin family's training grounds. It was here that all the knights trained, as well as those who wanted to improve their combat skills. When he and the Duke's aide entered the hall, the attendant asked what brought them there. Norms replied, "The young lady was very eager to see the training ground." The aide added, "Is that so? Actually, I have something to report." The girl looked ahead. Both boys were there. It was for them that she had decided to come here. When LeBlanc greeted both boys cheerfully, one of them asked hostilely, "What are you doing here?" The girl replied, "I just wanted to see Isaac and Henry." Isaac laughed loudly, stood up and said, "So you came all this way just because you missed me? It just irritates me." The girl meanwhile looked closely at his neck and noticed that there were no bruises or wounds there. After that, her gaze dropped to the boy's knees, and she noted that everything was clean there too. Then she looked at his wrists and seemed to notice something there. LeBlanc carefully examined the boy's wrists and couldn't figure out where the abrasions had come from. Were they from training or from blows? After that, she turned her head towards Henry. He had scratches too, but she needed to take a closer look. She noticed that he also had scratches on his wrists, and they looked quite strange. LeBlanc paused, analyzing what she'd seen. Could it really be concluded that both boys had been bullied and beaten? But, busy with her thoughts and observations, she did not notice the crack between the stones and leaned slightly, already ready to fall to the ground. LeBlanc screamed loudly and realized that she was already falling, unable to stop. But the next moment, someone's hand stopped her, and she did not fall with all her might to the ground. It was Henry who managed to catch the little rascal and save her from inevitable injuries. LeBlanc couldn't believe that someone had managed to save her, and thanked the boy. Henry smiled his soft smile at her and said, "You're welcome, young lady." She liked the way he smiled, but she still felt like something inside him was quietly whispering, "Stay away." It was a strange feeling, but she couldn't shake it. She looked at the boy and decided she didn't think he was a bad person. He might be cold, but he didn't strike her as cruel. At that moment, Isaac shouted at her, "You can barely even walk, you idiot!" She realized the boy was saying one thing, but really thinking something else. She sensed that all his hostility was just feigned, while in reality, he was very kind. LeBlanc thought about both boys. If they had both been bullied, their psyches might be shattered. This was all too familiar to her. She knew how terrible the hand of an adult could be. Suddenly, she noticed a man approaching them. It was the one she had been so afraid of. He leaned toward them and said, "I see you three are getting along well." A moment later, the man tried to touch her with his hand, and the girl became very scared. She was even ready to run away. When she heard the man's voice, she became even more frightened. Leaning over her, Lord Terramore said, "Children's hands are so soft." At that moment, he looked like a real maniac. The girl couldn't move when he touched her small palm with his fingers. After that, he covered her palm with his other hand and began to gently stroke it. Then he said, "Such delicate little hands. But if they don't encroach on what's not theirs, I won't have to take up the whip." The man's words terrified the girl. It seemed like an undisguised threat. She was horrified that he, with his kindly face, could say such terrible things. The man's face was reflected in her pupils, and at that very moment, she suddenly remembered where she had seen him before. She had clearly seen him in her first life. And then he had cried out, "Why didn't you drive me out of the country?" Lord Terramore confronted the young man. If he sat idly by, the Duke would kill him. He was told it was punishment for child abuse. The young man added that one must be responsible for one's actions in life, and even if it means death, he does not intend to take part in violence. Lord Terramore fell silent, frightened. He realized he would receive no protection or aid here. Afterwards, the Duke said he would help the young man escape. Even someone as insignificant as Terramore could serve as evidence exposing the family's crimes. Terramore was undoubtedly the scoundrel from earlier. Then he said, "From now on, I will accompany both young gentlemen in their training." The girl remembered everything and thought, "Is he really trying to take both boys away now? I can't let that happen." That is why LeBlanc screamed loudly, calling for the Duke's assistant to come to her. Norms turned his head in her direction, confused. His expression changed, seeing that the girl was upset about something. Most likely, someone had offended her. He looked at the old man, who also looked unusual. After the girl's scream, Norms thought she was about to tell him everything. Looking at the young man, the girl was pleased with herself. She had thought everything through in advance. Otherwise, why had she brought Norms with her? After this, the Duke's assistant asked Terramore how he ended up there. The old man replied that he had some free time and decided to say hello to his young students. Terramore added that they would have to postpone the pleasantries for another time. Slightly hunched over, the old man strode away from the training ground. One of the young men looked after him unkindly. It seemed Terramore was nowhere to be seen. One of the knights noticed that Terramore had once again been appointed as a mentor to the young lords. Norms thought that the elders were definitely behind this. It couldn't have just happened like that. They discussed it among themselves, and the Duke's assistant said they would need to speak with His Excellency. He then asked her to look after the baby while he was away. LeBlanc listened attentively to their conversation. She needed to find out who was being bullied by Lord Terramore. She was all ears, listening to the conversations, trying not to miss a single detail. Fear will still show through, and she will definitely find out about everything. Isaac yawned widely, stretched, and said, "Ah, again these elders decided everything themselves, without consulting anyone." Although Isaac didn't care, these words about Mentor Terramore clearly upset Henry. Just when the girl realized it was most likely Henry, the coach gave the order for everyone to take their positions, and her attention shifted again. One of the young men immediately stood up with a weapon in his hands and obeyed the command to continue the fight. Meanwhile, LeBlanc and Henry remained sitting on chairs in the shade, watching the upcoming fight. LeBlanc paused, unsure what to do next. It seemed Henry was the victim after all, but she still needed to confirm it. The spot where Norms had placed them before leaving was in full view of everyone. He said, "God forbid, if the little one hurts her legs again, she'll have to sit here." The girl was torn between conflicts. She considered whether to tell the Duke, but then decided against it. She had no proof. Moreover, there were no visible wounds on the boys' bodies. Perhaps they received them during training. LeBlanc knew she wouldn't do anything without proof. Saying everything without confirmation would be foolish. The Duke would find her strange. She turned her head to Henry. The boy sat as if nothing had happened, watching the trainer fight his brother. Suddenly, the girl thought it would be best if Henry told her everything himself. Perhaps he didn't want anyone to know, but why hide the obvious? At that moment, Isaac caught the girl's attention. As she watched him fight his trainer, she briefly wondered if he really had a real aura around him. This was a hallmark of the Dublon family. Many members of this family possessed it. It was even found among the Knights of the Holy Order of the Temple. An aura in battle testified to a warrior's exceptional strength and was a very rare occurrence. Only elite fighters could utilize it. Thanks to the aura, they acquired special strength and almost invulnerability, becoming practically invincible for ordinary warriors. And now the girl saw it in the boy. At such a young age, it was almost impossible. But Isaac truly possessed an aura. He raised his sword high and struck his opponent's sword with all his might. The coach felt a powerful blow and immediately shouted that he was giving up because he could not fight the young master. But Isaac didn't stop. He shouted loudly, "Why? If you lose, you die right now!" and raised his sword above his head. After this, he sharply lowered the weapon and thrust its tip into the stones with all his strength. Isaac was certainly a very powerful opponent, and not an easy one to defeat. But still, it was wrong to say to him, "This time I'll finish you off." The little girl watched in horror. She couldn't believe the boy could actually kill his rival. While she clenched her hands in fear, Henry, sitting next to her, calmly watched the proceedings. It seemed this was nothing new to him. Leblon began to pray. Isaac's expression frightened her. He looked terrifying, and she couldn't believe such a small boy could harbor so much malice. Leblon decided there was no point in getting involved with Isaac anymore. She firmly resolved to remember this and stay away from him. When the boy's opponent begged for mercy, Isaac yawned widely again and said, "I can't even find a worthy opponent. How boring!" The knight who had fought him raised his head from his knees and thanked the young master. He sighed with relief. Isaac had lost all interest in him. Leblon also sighed with relief. She was glad that Isaac was finally bored. But at the same time, Henry, sitting next to her, sighed heavily. It seemed the boy was in a terrible mood, and nothing could bring him joy. After this, Henry reluctantly rose from his chair and quietly said that now it was his turn. Now he would fight. Still sitting in her chair, Leblon propped her head up with her hand and thought, "I wonder how good Henry was." As he stood before his opponent, she thought, if he allowed Terramore to bully him, then he was unlikely to succeed in the upcoming fight. Henry calmly stood facing his opponent. He didn't even have a weapon in his hands. His only weapon was his own hand. While the girl was pondering his power, Henry raised his palm and pointed it toward his opponent. That was enough. The opponent sighed heavily and collapsed to the ground. The fall was so unexpected that even his heels flashed through the air before he fell limply onto the stones. After this, Henry calmly said, "The duel is over." He had won with virtually no effort. Someone announced, "Young Master Henry wins." Leblon was stunned. She couldn't believe how suddenly it all happened. Henry looked absolutely fantastic, while his opponent struggled to get to his feet. Looking at Henry, the girl realized that he was incredibly strong, and most likely, he had no worthy opponents here. Leblon wondered, then why the hell did this boy lose to Terramore? When another man approached and offered to fight him, the girl was still wondering why such a strong boy was being abused by an old man. A moment later, the man and the boy's swords crossed. At that moment, Leblon realized she had to save this warrior. If he engaged Henry, he would be doomed to certain death. But it seemed she was mistaken, as Henry's swordsmanship seemed inferior to his magic. Their strengths seemed unequal. The girl watched the duel in the training ground arena with interest. It seemed Henry was ready to give up or be defeated. The next moment, Henry found himself kneeling, a sword at his head. Even with her limited knowledge of martial arts, she dared to guess that his previous opponents had been many times stronger than this man. Perhaps because he was already old, she saw Henry's face, and it seemed to her that he didn't even want to resist the blows. He looked very strange and seemed resigned to his fate. The girl couldn't understand what had happened to him. It seemed Henry's strength had deserted him, and he was now completely helpless. The other warriors began to discuss the duel. One of them said that it seemed the young master was giving the old man a break. Another said that was hardly possible. It was impossible to believe that a man who had instantly defeated Peter would lose to some old man. LeBlanc thought for a moment, wondering if this was true and if the knights were right. She looked at the old man who had just managed to defeat the seemingly all-powerful Henry. This was highly unusual, and she needed to thoroughly investigate it. The old man swung his huge sword over his head and shouted, "Don't underestimate me!" Right in front of him sat a boy who didn't even dare raise his sword. What could have happened between them that he didn't dare resist? Henry's eyes looked terrified. He seemed terrified by the very sight of his opponent. He was clearly afraid of Lord Terramore. But a moment later, the boy gripped the hilt of his sword tightly, seemingly preparing a worthy rebuff. He rose from his knees, raised his weapon, and prepared to repel the attack, but his eyes gave him away. Henry's gaze was completely vacant and frightened. There was no longer the sparkle in his eyes, and now he looked at this old man with horror. Lord Terramore seemed to feel superior to the boy. He held his sword tightly and gazed with relish at his young adversary. After that, Henry turned his head away and didn't even look at Terramore. It was clear he was somehow dependent on it. At that moment, LeBlanc suddenly realized that Henry was in great pain. He was suffering, and no one even noticed. A moment later, LeBlanc jumped up from her chair, ran out, and stood in defense of the little boy. She stood in front of him and shouted loudly, "No!" The other knights, seeing this, gaped in fear. They were afraid that the old man's sword might somehow harm this little girl. Isaac looked at what was happening in surprise. Henry was equally surprised, as a little girl now stood in front of him, determined to protect him. LeBlanc seemed undeterred. She stood in front of Henry, arms spread wide, and shouted, "Don't hit him!" And although Lord Terramore told the little girl that it was just practice, the girl objected, saying that her grandfather was angry and hitting her brother. This was not practice at all. Henry's opponent stood up and looked at the girl. He suddenly realized she was indeed right. His face turned sad. After this, the man put his hand to his head and said, "And when people are driven by emotions, it's always cruel. You shouldn't act like that." After that, he extended his hand towards Henry and said, "I beg your pardon, young master." Henry suddenly froze, unsure what to do. He was both ashamed and hurt, yet he still couldn't understand what had happened to this girl and why she had done what she had done. After this, the young Duke Henry rose from his seat, turned around, and said just one word, "Enough." Then he walked away. Everyone watched the boy walk away, not understanding what was going on in his soul and how he felt. But it wasn't that simple. When Henry walked away, he lifted his shirt slightly and noticed that its edge had turned scarlet. Underneath, Henry had a small bleeding wound. A little girl, worried about his well-being, was already running to his aid. LeBlanc screamed loudly, without stopping for a second, "Are you hurt?" LeBlanc ran to Henry and began running around him, constantly asking where it hurt and asking him to let her take a look. The boy responded by asking her to leave him alone and why she was clinging to him. LeBlanc still didn't calm down and said that he was in pain, and therefore he needed to apply ointment and do a bandage. It suddenly occurred to her that perhaps Henry was afraid of doctors and therefore didn't want to attract attention. Anything was possible after all. He was still a child. After that, the girl said that her grandfather was a master of his craft and everything would be fine. He just needed to see a doctor who could help him, but Henry wasn't going to listen. He seemed to have completely lost his temper. Hearing her talk about fear, he shouted, "How can anyone be afraid of doctors?" Then he added, "I just hate that old man." LeBlanc looked at Henry in surprise. Had she really heard that about that old man? It spoke volumes. It seemed she was close to solving this puzzle. Could this really be true? Could she really put all the pieces together? Since Henry's words and the old man's were connected, everything seemed to fall into place. She thought that Henry was truly suffering, and his fear was not unfounded. She didn't like the Dublin family, but she still had to help this boy. Then she remembered someone else saying, "I don't like Dublin." Then he added, "Especially Kane, he's just unbearable." Another asked, "Does he mean the late Duke Kane Dublin?" The young man nodded his head slightly. Afterwards he said, "That's right. It was this Duke who killed my second son, Chris, right in front of his own grandson. And all because Chris was crippled." The girl recalled the bloody massacre she'd heard about in her previous life. From that conversation, she also learned that the late Duke of Dublin had justified himself by saying that a flawed person was useless, and if Henry had seen the previous Duke kill his son, The girl thought it might have something to do with him having seen his Duke grandfather kill his uncle because he was crippled. Now he's afraid of any old man because of that. Perhaps that childhood fright affected his psyche so much that now, when he sees the old man, he can't do anything. LeBlanc thought that maybe she was right, and now it was clear why Henry panicked at the sight of older men. No matter how smart he is, he's still a child. Perhaps Henry sees his injury as a flaw, and Lord Terramore is exploiting it, imposing the belief that any flaw is equal to death. The scoundrel has figured it out and is taking full advantage of it. Perhaps this is why Henry is now hiding the fact of his abuse from his father, the Duke of Dublon. He doesn't want to report it due to the trauma he suffered as a child. LeBlanc clenched her fists and, trembling slightly, decided that the injury needed to be made public. This vile old man needed to be brought to justice. After this, the girl thought for a moment and decided that she needed to calm down first. She needed to come up with some kind of foolproof plan so as not to look clumsy and out of place. It would be wise to keep your mouth shut for now, as Lord Terramore is a member of Duke Dublon's council, so he is likely to be more trustworthy than some little girl. The girl decided to wait it out for now. Even if she told him everything, it was entirely possible Henry would deny her words, and then she wouldn't be able to prove anything. Henry is extremely frightened and has little self-control. He won't be able to explain himself clearly, most likely, and then those around him will consider her crazy and, in the worst case, kick her out of the house altogether. LeBlanc thought about it and decided that it was absolutely necessary to solve this problem. LeBlanc knew that this was, in many ways, the problem with a child's body. The problem was that she still had a conscience, and she acted accordingly. She decided that this boy needed some reassurance, as she felt so sorry for him. So LeBlanc tried to gently stroke Henry's head as he stood next to her, but he didn't seem to appreciate it. He suddenly became aggressive and shouted loudly, "What's wrong with you?" LeBlanc said, "I really like a boy named Henry." After this, the little girl extended her hand to the boy and said, "I will protect you, Henry." She didn't yet know how, but she was confident that she would succeed. Henry looked at her. He couldn't understand what she meant, and he thought no one could save him, because even he himself wasn't capable of it. And what can we say about the girl? But the girl was determined. Her eyes lit up as she realized there was simply no other way out, and so she had to stand up for him, and later he would repay her for the favor by not causing her any unnecessary trouble. She was confident she would demonstrate to him the superb survival skills she had acquired over 3 lifetimes. The face of Lord Terramore appeared before her eyes, and knowing that he was a very dangerous opponent, she decided that she would make sure to use all her survival skills and caution to make his life a living hell. The doors leading into the mansion were locked, and the gates leading into the grounds were also locked. A little girl walked along the lawn near the palace and admired the beautiful flowers that had appeared quite recently. When they had admired the flowers to their heart's content, they sat down with her favorite maid under a tree. Lily asked the young mistress if she liked violets. The girl replied that yes, they were very beautiful. After that, the girl suddenly seemed to remember something. She noticed that the maid's watch showed almost 4 o'clock. That very man was supposed to arrive soon. The girl decided to take action, and therefore, turning to the girl, said, "I'm frozen." Hearing this, Lily hugged the girl and said, "In that case, maybe we should go inside." Lily and LeBlanc, sitting on the grass, slowly began to rise. The girl decided that now was the right time to put her plan into action, but she was in no hurry. She took the wreath she had woven with her own hands and held it out to the girl, saying, "I made this especially for you." The delighted and amazed maid immediately grabbed her cheeks with both hands and exclaimed, "Oh my God!" The girl felt like a real fox maid. She needed to make sure her maid got out of here somewhere. Somehow, Lily needed to be provoked into being alone. This needed to be done as soon as possible. As they walked, they saw guards at the gate. These were the people who cared about the safety of the others. And now they stood at the locked gates. The girl leaning over LeBlanc said, "Since you're a little chilled, I'll go and get you a coat and a blanket." To which the girl happily agreed, replying, "Okay." She watched Lily slowly make her way toward the palace. She knew that Duke Dublon's office was also in that direction. The girl thought for a moment. It seemed everything was going perfectly, and perhaps luck would be on her side today. She imagined Lord Terramore's face. He was the one she needed to get even with. That old geezer would get a good dance if she could pull off her plan. She had already begun to think about what she needed to do and had prepared for it the day before. The Duke's assistant turned to her and asked, "What exactly brought you here?" Leblon explained to him, "I really want to see the Duke. If possible, I would like to meet him now." The young assistant replied, "I understand." And taking the baby in his arms, he immediately went with her to the Duke's office, telling His Grace that he had guests. Duke Dublon was delighted to see the girl, cleared his throat slightly, and then asked, "What are you doing here? Do you really love me that much?" The girl, who had climbed onto the man's lap, immediately replied, "Of course, I love you very much," while she herself began to look at the papers on the Duke's desk. Thus, she took up a very important task, collecting the information she needed, which was vital for the upcoming case. At this point, the Duke asked his aide, "What's the current status of the creation of the advisory body? We need to hurry with this." The young man replied, "Everything is going according to plan, and today he will be presented to the vassals of Duke Dublon." Leblon decided that by spending as much time as possible with the Duke, she would be able to learn more about Lord Terramore. This would prove very useful for her plan. After this, the Duke asked his assistant if there was a vacancy on the Council of Elders. He needed this information to know what to do next. Leblon decided that the Duke had a very difficult job, while her assistant replied that all the elders kept a close eye on each other, especially Lords Terramore and Messenge. Hearing about Terramore, she immediately became wary. She wondered what she knew about Lord Messenge. She knew something about Lord Terramore, but now she needed to learn as much as possible about this man as well. She heard that Lord Terramore and another lord were well-known sworn enemies. The young Duke's assistant had just told him this. The young man then added that their relationship could degenerate into a silent war. The girl was overjoyed. Did Lord Terramore really have an enemy? This was very good news. If everything went as planned, she wouldn't have to lift a finger. The palace simply sparkled, polished to a shine. Flowers adorned the beautiful garden right in front of the palace. The girl prepared to carry out her plan, noticing that the one she needed was slowly walking and approaching her. It was located very close to the family crest of the Dukes of Dublon. This noble family had served them for many generations. The head of the Messenge family was a fairly young man. He was handsome, and his name was Viscount Carn Messenge Tro. The young man noticed the girl waiting for him, and, unexpectedly for her, turned his head in her direction. He saw the girl simply standing in the garden and spoke to her. "I never thought I would meet the child of destiny here." After this, the young man turned to Leblon and asked, "What are you doing here? Besides, it's chilly outside now." The girl turned happily toward him. Everything was exactly as she had planned. She knew the young man would ask this question. She answered the young man, "I'm waiting here for Grandpa Terra." When the girl said, "Henry, Isaac, and I will study together," the young man laughed loudly and exclaimed, "What can you learn from such a person? He has superficial knowledge, and he himself is an ordinary old man." After this, the Viscount laughed loudly and said, "Well, in any case, he is not able to impart knowledge to you, since he himself is distinguished by his feeble-mindedness." But Leblon wasn't about to give up. Everything was going according to plan, so she said, "That's not it. Grandfather is good." Then Leblon added, "Lord Terramore even said he'll be wearing a beautiful robe very soon." The matter was that Lord Terramore might become a member of the Elder Council. This robe was the symbol of the elders of the Dublon clan. All who were members of this council had such robes and made important decisions for the duchy by general vote. The girl specifically mentioned this crimson robe. It was the very thing the young man standing before her coveted. When the Viscount heard about the robe, he literally flew into a rage, and after the girl responded to his words with, "It's true," he declared. "This, of course, is nonsense. This place should belong to me." Leblon still didn't let up. She said, "I heard from Lord Terramore that everything has already been decided. He is the one who must become a member of the council, and it is this grandfather who will be given the mantle." The young man said nothing more. He wondered, had the chairman really decided everything secretly himself, and now nothing depended on him? The girl was pleased with herself. The conversation had gone exactly as she wanted. Perhaps she would get her way after all. She decided to finish off the Viscount and said, "Terramore said this: We will yet see how the idiot who imagined that the robe belongs to him will cry tears of blood. After that, LeBlanc smiled and asked the young man, "Maybe you want to see it too?" But the girl couldn't continue any further. The Viscount quickly turned around, gritting his teeth, and saying, "I have to go now, I have a lot to do," headed off into the distance. The girl watched him go and silently wished this gentleman a good time. LeBlanc was pleased with herself. She wished this man would fight Terramore in her place and cause a huge scandal. It was a secret meeting behind the walls of a rather gloomy building. It was a gathering place for those who didn't want to be seen together elsewhere. The man slammed his palm loudly on the table, as if calling the rest of those gathered there to complete silence. After that, he spoke loudly and said, "What do you think about creating a new advisory body?" Another supported him, saying, "That's right. The elders have always been responsible for nominating the leader. Why should that change now?" Then a third said, "In that case, our council loses all meaning, and there's no point in us meeting together." When the Lord, who sat at the head of the council, was asked, "Are you simply going to watch from the sidelines?" The man replied, "Can His Grace's will really still be swayed?" It was the chairman of the Council of Elders, Jean-Marc Noanoc. He had held the position for many years. The man said, "Some people have no choice but to follow the orders of the leader." The young man asked again, "What do you mean? Is our entire meeting really useless, and will everything be decided in secret from us?" The chairman looked and declared, "We must place our hopes on a new leader who will have to stand by our side. We simply have no other choice." Then another of those present spoke up, Lord Terramore, and now his face was inspired. He looked completely different. The old man said loudly, "Yes, the young gentlemen are the future of the Dublon family," added someone present. Then the old man was told, "You are obligated to teach young people with the utmost sincerity." Old Terramore replied, "Certainly, that is exactly what I do." When he was told, "Then we will always be by your side," Lord Terramore replied, "There is no need to worry. They are entirely in my hands, and I will ensure that everything is impeccable with the Duke's sons." The smiling man added, "Then we can seize power ourselves, and the Duke's sons will be only nominal rulers." Another person was listening to all this. The Viscount listened in on the conversation, and it was unpleasant for him to hear such words. The young man's fists clenched nervously, his hands trembling. He was ready to clash with Lord Terramore, who seemed to be already imagining himself a council member and trying on a purple robe. Old man Terramore stopped in front of two people, one of whom was a tall young man, and the other was dressed in a green doublet. They were conversing among themselves. The young man said, "It seems His Grace will soon grant Lord Terramore a crimson robe." The old man replied, "You flatter me greatly, gentlemen." The other added, "You are too modest." Lord Terramore truly dreamed of the purple robe, but he still did not want to rush things and waited for everything to happen naturally. The old man thought his time had finally come. He came from a poor family, and young people always denied him the opportunity to advance. He hated rich young men who were a thorn in his side and prevented him from rising through the ranks. He was ambitious. He hated such upstarts with all his heart, thinking that if he had wealth, he would have achieved a much higher position and power. But now, smiling sweetly at these gentlemen, Lord Terramore decided that this time everything would be different. Everything would be exactly as he planned, because the chairman had noticed him, and now much was in his hands. He thought of his charges. Raising children to suit his tastes was a simple matter for Lord Terramore. Henry was unable to resist him due to his injury. Things are completely different with Isaac. There, things are even simpler. All you have to do is apply pressure, and he'll break right away. Lord Terramore felt he had everything in his hands. He could manipulate the Duke's sons, and then they would make the decisions he desired, and he himself would rise. Looking at these young men, he was sure he would soon achieve his goal. And when a young man next to him said, "When you take your rightful place," the Lord replied that, of course, he was ready. But there was another man among them who was disgusted by this talk. Viscount Messing jumped up from his seat and said, "Are they really planning to sell the bear's skin even before it's caught?" One of those present added that, according to seniority, Lord Terramore should be next. But he did not have time to finish. Viscount laughed loudly and declared that he had acquired this seniority by working as a servant in the Lord's house. and that he was completely unworthy to sit on the Council of Elders. Lord Terramore hung his head. He looked at the Viscount from under his brows, not daring to answer, but someone else spoke for him. One of those present told the Viscount that such rudeness toward a man old enough to be his father was unacceptable. But this wasn't enough for the Viscount. He said, "I can't help it. Lord Terramore still has the habits of those long-gone days when he served the lords." Lord Terramore, who stood before him, and one of his henchmen watched the Viscount in silence. The Viscount decided to go all the way. He declared, "Lord Terramore is a man who can hardly support himself. He's fooling everyone, being uneducated, and a nasty man. Terramore couldn't stand this." He glared angrily at the young Viscount with all the hatred he could muster. A verbal altercation ensued, in which the Viscount failed to conceal his indignation. "Lord Terramore has now been appointed tutor to the young gentleman? What's so surprising about that?" As before, Lord Terramore remained silent in response. After this, the young Viscount Messing leaned towards the ear of the Lord, standing in front of him, and quietly whispered, "How much do you think I know about your weaknesses?" This was serious. Lord Terramore's eyes darkened, his face distorted with hatred, and he hissed quietly. The Viscount persisted. Messing advised Lord Terramore not to aim for a position beyond his capabilities. At this point, Lord Terramore's hands began to tremble nervously. He seemed at a loss for words, and only kept repeating helplessly, You! After this, the Lord shouted, "I will tear you to pieces, you vile spawn!" The young butler paced the corridor of the ducal palace. Everything was as usual at this time of day. Everything was on schedule. Suddenly, somewhere ahead, he heard quiet footsteps. Someone was walking, their slippers making a noise on the carpet. It was little LeBlanc, trying to walk as quietly as possible. Coming closer, she decided to see what was going on. She saw a man pulling another by the collar and shouting, "You cannot trust the children's future to an unsuitable teacher." Another shouted, "How dare you?" Someone else said, "The issue of his position should be raised and brought to the attention of his lordship." The girl thought her plan had worked. Had they really brought this up again? That was excellent. As expected of someone who had become a candidate for the position of elder at such a young age, she was sure the Viscount wouldn't be happy about it. After all, he knew perfectly well how to play dirty. The Viscount began to speak and agitate those present. He declared that the position of tutor to the Duke's children was only worthy of members of families that had served the Duke for at least 5 generations, while Lord Terramore's family had only spent 1 with him. He then continued, if his father heard that Terramore was claiming the position of elder, he would most likely rise from the dead. Seeing the support of others inspired the Viscount. He claimed to have connections in schools and regional districts, then began to talk about how Terramore had taken on the education of young gentlemen, and how Mr. Isaac's grades had dropped by a full 0.2%. In short, everyone noticed. Lord Terramore was completely out of favor. The girl was certain Lord Messing would have made a much better elder. Duke Doublon thought exactly the same. Lord Terramore's fate seemed sealed. He was not destined to become a mentor to the young lords, or to join the Council of Elders. LeBlanc was completely satisfied. She was pleased with how she'd pulled it off, and felt genuine bliss. Stirring up the conflict had proven the right decision, and now everyone's attention was focused on Terramore. The girls who came up to her asked why the young lady was in such a good mood today, but she, unfortunately, could not tell them anything, although it was known that evil thoughts bring pleasure. LeBlanc understood that with Messing desperately searching for his weaknesses, Terramore wouldn't be able to lay a finger on Henry. Unless, of course, he was an idiot. The arguments needed to continue, and she decided to use the chaos as an opportunity to replace her mentor. One of the girls laughed and said that perhaps the young lady was happy because she already knew that she had brought a new rocking horse for her. Another of the girls said she thought the reason was that she had given the young lady a 3,000-piece puzzle. Another girl got angry and shouted that puzzles were just a real entertainment for boys. But the young lady preferred the horse. After that, the girl said, "In that case, let's argue about what's better, puzzles or some kind of horse?" The girl who was talking about the horse said that if she lost this bet, she would be ready to gouge out her eyes and juggle them like a real juggler. It seemed like a real storm was starting, and at that moment, the girl said that it would be better for the young lady to leave here, and pulled LeBlanc by the hand. LeBlanc didn't really want to leave, so she decided to pretend that she was actually having a lot of fun. Taking the girl by both hands, both maids immediately dragged her along with them. In the hallway, the girl saw Isaac, who as usual was holding a book. Upon seeing her, he addressed her as baby. LeBlanc immediately greeted the boy and asked where he was going. Isaac said he was on his way to the training ground. After this, the nasty boy laughed loudly and declared that his brother was now having a retake, and this time he finished early because he wrote the test without any mistakes. LeBlanc nearly fainted at these words. It was incomprehensible. She couldn't believe that Isaac had passed the test and Henry would have to retake it. She thought that while Isaac was certainly talented, Henry was still far ahead of him in terms of intelligence, and it was beyond her comprehension how that could have happened. The worried maids and Isaac looked worriedly at the dumbfounded girl, who was busy with her thoughts. The next moment, LeBlanc was running off somewhere. There was only one thought in her head. Henry couldn't possibly fail a test that even Isaac had passed. She held out her hand, thinking Henry had definitely been set up, and it was obvious who was behind it. With that thought in mind, she burst into the room where the classes were taking place. She abruptly opened the door and saw the old man, who was Lord Bear Terramore, waving his hand. LeBlanc saw Henry kneeling in front of him, holding his cheek with his hand. She thought the Lord was using cruelty to keep Henry under his control, and she wasn't wrong. She thought the beatings were just a brainwashing tool, but it turned out to be otherwise. Lord Terramore pretended nothing had happened and smiled sweetly, turning to the girl. "What are you doing here during class?" LeBlanc pursed her lips and thought he was a real bastard. She said it wasn't a job, and the Lord was beating Henry. The old man smiled and replied that this was a very dangerous statement. Would he dare raise his hand against the young master? The girl didn't let up. She declared that she had seen everything with her own eyes and was not mistaken. Lord Terramore tried to justify himself. "I never allowed myself anything like that, but if something really happened, it was only a gesture of love and care." The old man began to smile and say that he loved the young master very much and would never dare raise his hand against him with an evil thought. The girl listened attentively. He was quite cunning, thus compensating for the inferiority complex that arose from being born into a poor family, and vented his anger by beating the children of aristocrats. The next moment, the girl's gaze stopped on the feather that lay near the old man's hand. Without thinking for a second about interrupting the lesson, she grabbed the pen from the table. LeBlanc immediately grabbed the quill in her hand, and with all her might thrust it straight into Lord Terramore's hand, which he was leaning on the table with. Blood immediately gushed from the old man's wound, which, in general, was no different from the blood of other people. The old man first screamed in pain, and then at the girl, asking, "What have you decided to do?" LeBlanc stood in front of the boy and said, "I am protecting this man's health and dignity." Henry stood behind her. He could only see the back of the girl's head, the one who had dared to stand up for him and challenge a true villain. The boy froze in surprise. He couldn't understand what the hell was happening. He couldn't understand how this girl could dare do something like that. LeBlanc, on the other hand, felt absolutely wonderful. She knew what she was doing and was confident that nothing would happen to her. Besides, she already had 3 lifetimes behind her. After this, the girl turned around and extended her hand to Henry, inviting him to go with her. The boy froze for a moment. He couldn't understand why LeBlanc had decided to help him. He didn't believe such a thing could happen, and now he was terrified of the consequences. Eventually, Henry headed for the exit. Since he was moving so slowly, LeBlanc even had to nudge him slightly. The old lord still wouldn't let up. He shouted a vicious curse after the girl and called her a scoundrel. The girl wasn't about to leave just like that either. She suddenly turned her head back and gave the lord such an icy look that he even felt a little frightened. Her eye gleamed predatorily, as if threatening him. After that, the girl smiled slightly and said, "Just wait." The old man gritted his teeth loudly again when the girl added in parting that the Duke would soon learn of Henry's abuse. He clenched his fist weakly and watched her go silently. Henry, accompanied by his companion, walked down the hallway. He couldn't get the situation he found himself in out of his head. He couldn't understand how this little girl had dared to do something that sometimes would be difficult even for an adult. LeBlanc extended her hand to the boy and said, "Henry, we should go see a doctor." It would have been better not to tell her this, because the boy literally went wild. He rushed at her, shouting, "Are you crazy? Aren't you scared?" Henry couldn't calm down. He warned LeBlanc that this was all very dangerous, and that she might regret it later, because Terramore was the most vile person he knew. He added, "Don't you know that?" LeBlanc looked the boy in the face, completely unfazed, and calmly replied, "I'm not afraid at all." She truly wasn't afraid of Lord Terramore. Looking at Henry, she thought that it was unknown what could be more painful than cruelty. Wounds left on the heart take a very long time to heal. And the man who beat Henry didn't frighten her at all. The girl remembered her past life. She knew there were things more painful than an aching arm or a fever that came on at night from a beating. Waiting could be far more painful. LeBlanc recalled the suffering she'd endured in a previous life. Back then, she'd thought about what would happen if someone raised a hand against her again tomorrow, and she'd literally tremble with terror. This constant fear gnaws at her from within every time. She remembered seeing other children being beaten. It was horrific, and that's why she never wanted anyone to bully anyone else. LeBlanc froze for a moment and almost burst into tears. After the events of her previous lives, she couldn't turn a blind eye to what was happening, because she had once been through the same thing. So she said to Henry, "If you don't like Grandpa Doctor, then maybe you should go to the Duke. Please, let's do that." Henry looked at his companion hesitantly and in amazement, but said nothing. He was afraid to even mention what had happened to him, and so he simply wanted to forget it all as quickly as possible. LeBlanc tried to persuade him again, but the boy replied, "You should just forget about all this." She understood that Henry was in pain and that children shouldn't suffer, but she didn't yet know what to do next. The next moment, the boy pushed her hand away, then the girl herself, and screamed loudly, "I said, stay out of it!" After that, Henry added, "And don't tell anyone what happened today. It must remain a secret." After these words, Henry turned around and walked away, and LeBlanc remained standing in the corridor, looking after the departing boy. She couldn't believe she hadn't managed to unfreeze the child after all. She hoped he would finally find the courage to tell the Duke everything that had happened. At the same time, Lord Terramore moved quickly down the corridor. He had decided to turn the situation to his advantage and was heading toward Duke Dublan's office. The old man clenched and unclenched his fist, cursing all the while. He called the girl a little rat who dared to interfere in his affairs. He suddenly remembered how strangely the 4-year-old had looked at him, claiming to be showing love and care, and then calling him pathetic. It was completely unlike her. The old man decided this girl was no ordinary child at all. How could a 4-year-old know such words? Something was clearly wrong. After that, he remembered her eyes. They weren't the eyes of a 4-year-old girl. They held a pressure a small child simply couldn't bear. In his imagination, this little girl was a veritable spawn of the devil, mocking him. Lord Terramore was certain she was not a child of fate at all, but the devil himself. He decided that Temple had sent the wrong person. A child of fate could not be such a treacherous creature. These thoughts haunted the old lord. But even if that was true, did this girl really think that he would lose to someone like her? With these thoughts, he stopped in front of the door of the Duke of Dublin's office. He paused for a moment, then knocked, and entering said, "Your Grace, this is Terramore." Imagine the man's indignation when he heard the girl's quiet cries and her words in his office. Hearing this, he assumed the girl had already reported him for raising his hand to Henry, so he shouted loudly, "Your Grace, listen to me!" The Lord spoke and asked the Duke, "Do you really think that the old man is capable of such a vile act?" The old lord shook all over and declared in a trembling voice that it was just a misunderstanding. Judging by the expressions on everyone's faces, he realized the girl had told him everything, but an excuse had to be made, and so Lord Terramore shouted loudly, "This is all the young lady's plan! I wouldn't dare lay a finger on the young master!" The next moment, he noticed that Duke Dublin looked at him very strangely and asked again, "What other young master?" The girl sitting on his lap turned her head towards the Duke. The man's face now looked terrifying. He had suddenly transformed from a kind, gentle man into a true beast, with gleaming, cruel eyes. Someone present also turned their head towards the old man and asked, "Which young master are you talking about? What did you want to say?" The old man began to justify himself, claiming he had been falsely accused. Then he suddenly stopped, wondering why the situation here was so tense. The next moment, he saw the girl stick her tongue out at him. This clever little devil seemed to have simply tricked him. Her whole demeanor suggested he must have thought she'd already told him about the situation with Henry, but that was far from the case. Old Lord Terramore immediately clutched his head. He realized it had been nothing more than a bait he'd fallen for. The girl had deliberately done this to panic him, and he'd started confessing everything himself. The old man fell to his knees and suddenly understood everything. She hadn't intended to report him from the start. True, she'd only been here a couple of months. He decided that the girl had been sent to the temple by Duke Dublon's sworn enemy, and it seemed she had caused him to fall into her trap. The old man thought that, compared to the girl, he was a loyal servant who had dedicated his entire life to the Dukes of Dublon. This is precisely what he told the Duke now. The man hoped his authority was much higher. Moreover, Henry would keep his mouth shut due to his injury and wouldn't be able to tell anyone anything. The Lord realized he'd fallen into his own trap. Even if he'd tried to explain himself, no one would have believed Henry, and now the girl had deceived him, making him look guilty. Afterwards, Norm said, "We were only discussing Lord Terramore yelling at a young lady over a minor mistake, and nothing more." And the man added, "It seems the Lord is speaking completely about another situation." The old man immediately began to justify himself, but was immediately silenced by Duke Dublon's heavy gaze. He asked, "Why are you acting so suspiciously, Lord Terramore?" The Duke's other courtiers looked at him with the same disapproval. The girl was pleased with how everything had turned out. Her plan had worked, and the old man had fallen into her trap. Lord Terramore hung his head, and sweat trickled down his trembling face. LeBlanc thought she'd just been playing with him, and he still hadn't understood.